Isidor and Ida Straus were one of America's wealthiest couples, and their death shook the Western world. How did Ida die? And what precious object was recovered after the sinking? And what was the relationship between George Rosenshine and Gertrude Mabel Thorne? And then there is the story of the Addergoole 14, traveling to America to find a new life on the steamship RMS Titanic. Will they survive? All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep. She was the largest and most opulent ocean liner of the time. Launched in 1912, the White Star Line built Titanic not for speed, but for luxury. Travel in each of the three classes was above and beyond that on any other ship. Third-class passengers, most of whom were immigrants on their way to America, enjoyed better food and better beds than they had ever known in their lives. On the other end of the scale, the opulence of first class was unparalleled for ships of that era. What did these two classes have in common? Love. Love for one another, love of family, love that lasts to this very day. When Titanic struck the iceberg and the call came to abandon ship, it was women and children first. In first class, there were 144 women. They had the best chance of survival. Their cabins were closer to the lifeboats, and their status gave them extra consideration from the crew. And yet, 4 women from first class died that April night, including Ida Straus. Ida Straus was the wife of well-known American businessman Isidor Straus. She clearly would have been offered a place in a lifeboat. So why did she die? To understand her death, we must first understand her life and the love story of Ida and Isidor Straus.
They both were born in Germany and came here as young children. They met when they were sort of set up by those who felt that they might be compatible, and pretty much from the very beginning, they developed a fondness for one another.
Isidor and Ida were, I think, really an extraordinary and unusual couple. Their relationship was one of total devotion, always.
We have 3 boxes filled with letters. Every time they were separated, they wrote letters every single day.
And it's so clear that their admiration for one another, their love for one another, their partnership was extraordinary, especially for that time.
It was really the Victorian era, and people did not write about sexuality, about sex. And yet we have one letter that Ida expresses to Isidor that she's excited that their being apart is about to be over and that they can resume their lovemaking, that she was looking forward to a time when they can be intimate together. This is very, very unusual for that period.
I am rather late for the mail again. We do so much talking all morning, and I have exceptionally deferred my most pleasant duty to the last minute. I am so glad our imaginary lovemaking will soon be at an end, and that we will not require writing paper as our intermediary anymore. Your devotedly, Mama.
They really cherished one another. I know that's kind of an old-fashioned thing to say, but I think it's suitable. Theirs was, in fact, a love story, because I think they really set a model for those of us who are among their descendants.
Isidor was a merchant. He was an owner of Macy's, along with his brother, Nathan. Isidor was always known as Mr. Isidor, and he knew every single one of his employees by name. The employees were very fond of him and very grateful for this wonderful job. They treated them very well. At Macy's, they had the first mutual aid society. They had the first doctor and nurse on premises for their employees. Isidor was a friend to many presidents, but also a consultant. He did many, many things. In 1911, they still had a lot of family, both of them, in Germany. And so they decided that they were able to take a winter abroad. Then when it was getting to be early April, they were starting to feel it was time to come home. But there was a coal strike going on at that time.
Because of the coal strike, White Star Line diverted coal and passengers from other ships, so Titanic could make her maiden voyage as scheduled on April 10th, 1912.
So really the reason they were on Titanic is because it was one of the only ships going at that point. When they got to the ship, Ida wrote a thank you letter. And we have that letter, which is on Titanic stationery, and it is the last letter that she wrote. It describes the ship. She says, oh, what a ship. These aren't really cabins. These are wonderful rooms, this suite of rooms that we have, and they're so lovely. And then the letter was mailed in Cherbourg, where Titanic stopped to drop off mail, pick up food and supplies and other passengers. And so we have this letter with such a wonderful description of the surroundings.
Titanic was a three-class system. You had the upper class traveling in first, you had the middle class traveling in second, and you had immigrants traveling in third. The White Star Line, her owners, had realized that speed was kind of a dead end. So what happened was the White Star Line said, let's concentrate on luxury. And so when the Olympic and Titanic and the Britannic were all designed, the emphasis was on spaciousness, elegance, refinement of design, and novelty in amenities.
There was a style to traveling in first class, with many passengers bringing their servants and a complete wardrobe so that their dress would suit the elegance of their seagoing surroundings. Some of the artifacts recovered and conserved from the debris field surrounding Titanic reveal fascinating details about the people who were on board and their standard of dress while on Titanic.
So we have a man's collapsible top hat. Right now there's a support that keeps it in this position as we're showing it for exhibitions as well as for the safety and travel. With the textiles, once we get the saline out, once we get all the salt out, we want to make sure there are no other impurities in there. So for example, in the debris field, you have a lot of the metal corrosive bacteria. That's what's destroying the Titanic at this time. And you can look at some of the textiles that have been conserved and kind of get an idea just by looking at them, how close they were to all of that metal that was rusting. This is made of primarily silk. What we have on the top of the hat right now is this discoloration, and this has been in close proximity to the rust that's breaking down the metal of the Titanic and has weeped onto the fabric, causing degradation. Another good reason for having the mount on the inside to give it support so it doesn't put pressure on these weak threads. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed, making sure that bacteria is gone. So this is the liner that was inside the hat that tells where the hat came from. All right, so the label from the inside is Herbert Johnson, 38 New Bond Street in London.
An exclusive shop in London, likely frequented by a wealthy first-class passenger, although we do not know this for sure, or indeed who the hat actually belonged to.
First class were kept in the luxury to which they had become accustomed. Even though they had the best of everything and all they could possibly want, keeping them happy for 4 or 5 days on an ocean liner could be a little bit of a task. I think also something needs to be said for third class. This was not exactly a vacation for third class, but it was as close as they were probably going to get. You didn't have to get up at 4 in the morning and milk the cows. It was a different world.
The story of Titanic is, to some degree, the story of the worldwide immigration that took place in the early 20th century as the world economy shifted from agriculture to industry. While first and second class received most of the attention, Titanic was also built to carry immigrants who were dreaming of a better life in America. This was especially true for the many Irish who were leaving their country in droves. This trinket, painted with shamrocks, was found in Titanic's debris field. It's believed to be a keepsake of Ireland, a memory for someone who recently traveled there or something a young girl might carry with her to remind her of her Irish homeland. This artifact will travel with Alex Klingelhofer to Ireland and the small country parish of Addergoole, where over 100 years after the sinking of Titanic, a memorial is still held every April 15th.
Well, in the early 1900s, they had just got over the most terrible century we've ever had, when we had a desperate famine. In fact, 1/3 of the population died. And after that, then, there was nothing here. People kind of had to go. Usually, the oldest girl might go to America and send back a little bit of money. And eventually, the fare would be there for another girl to go. With the result that an awful lot of girls went from Ireland to America, that they would never again be seen in their homes. They were going never to come back.
For most of the Addergoole 14, this was their first time beyond their tiny parish, their first time in large crowds of people, and their very first time sailing on a ship. Today, we can only imagine their excitement at leaving for the new world. Their bravery is inspiring. But would they survive Titanic's fate, now only 3 days away? Here in this top-secret warehouse in Atlanta lie artifacts recovered from the wreck site that reveal incredible stories of Titanic. The collection of artifacts, painstakingly maintained by the Salver in Possession of the Titanic Wreck, EMG, contains clues on the clear definition between the 3 classes on Titanic. These plates, recovered from the ocean floor, were used to serve passengers on board Titanic.
First, you have the first class here. This wasn't actually used in the dining saloon. We believe this belonged to the special service, which would have been used to serve meals in the cabins. You can see it's got a wonderful cobalt blue and gold decoration. It has the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company monogram in the center of it, and that was the parent organization of White Star Line. This decoration was able to survive immersion in the salt water, whereas the other chinas washed away, so all we can see is a haze of what they looked like. It's interesting to note that every single piece of china that were provided to the Titanic was not stamped with anything that said Titanic. So if anything says Titanic, it's a fake. This china, the blue and white Delft, was used in second class. It's a beautiful pattern that is still produced today. The decal, which was the swallowtail flag and banner for the White Star Line, you can see has faded a bit. That's because it's a decal and applied later. This is the third class ware. This is a soup bowl. They had a lot of stews and soup in third class. You have some of the staining that occurred being associated with iron objects.
Objects found near the rusting metal of Titanic often picked up staining caused by the rust.
For instance, on this one, you have the iron stain. One could try to get rid of that, but to be honest, you probably never would, because that's now into the fabric of the plate. But there are other types of treatments that can remove it so it's lessened, and that's what we've done here.
The term parish is used by the church to refer to a group of villages within a geographical area and serviced by one priest. The 14 passengers from the parish of Addergoole in Western Ireland were either related to each other or already knew each other. And for each of them, this voyage would change their lives forever.
Addergoole 14 were 14 people who decided to emigrate to America, the promised land as it is over here. They preferred to go to America rather than go to the UK. UK was kind of hard industrial scenario, whereas the America was the place to go.
You know, my uncle Pat, he was 21 years of age, and he was the 5th in a family of 7. Well, there was no work here for them. They'd only came from a very small farm, so they had to immigrate to America.
The cost of even a third-class ticket to cross the Atlantic was a huge expense for a family of modest means. It could take them months to save up enough money.
It was said that my Uncle Pat was saying goodbye to his mother, and she passed him a gold sovereign. And the sovereign slipped from his hand and it dropped to the floor, which they said at the time that was bad luck. And unfortunately, it was for him.
So the process of conservation for Titanic had to be really developed because it's considered a deep water site, and not many artifacts had been recovered from deep water sites. When an object is recovered, the process was immediately to photograph it, measure it on the expedition ship, and assign a permanent number to it. And then bag it in water from the site, and then it was transferred in seawater to a land laboratory. I think each artifact that is recovered from the wreck site of Titanic has something important to say. It may be about how something was manufactured, it might be how an object was used. First of all, I love Ireland. I think it's a beautiful country, and I think the immigration from Ireland to America greatly influenced how our country grew. This seems to me to be a small souvenir of Ireland with the shamrock. It appears to be just, a small little trinket dish that you'd put on your bureau, something you might put in a window ledge. Just something to remind you of Ireland, of home, of where you came from. It's like a little touchstone for someone.
The authority went together and they thought this is a great way to do it, and it was a good idea. There were no experience of life, should we say. So going over to America was a huge challenge for them. It was such a tragedy they happened to get on to Titanic and not the Celtic the day after that, and the other liner that came in the day before. It was just bad, pure bad luck that they landed on Titanic.
If you were lucky and wealthy enough to be traveling in first class, your chance of survival was much greater than in third.
You know, my Uncle Pat, he was on the Titanic in steerage, and of course, when the Titanic was going down, the third-class passengers weren't able to get to the upper decks.
You get references to both types of stories. Those stories where the third-class passengers were helped, and the third-class passengers that say they were not helped. So I don't know that there's a way to get to the bottom truth of that. And people suffered for it, yes.
You have to understand that when Titanic began to sink, it was hell on earth for the poor things because of no idea where they were, what they were doing. They'd never been in crowds in their lives before.
Titanic had an evacuation suggestion. I wouldn't call it a plan. It was not completely thought out and regimented and rehearsed the way we do it today.
So they found a ladder that was leading to the upper decks. So to get to the lifeboats, they brought the Addergoole 14 and other people up to the upper decks.
They were some of the lucky ones. Well, I won't say lucky, but at the time they were the ones who got up onto the next level where the crew were rounding up the people to get on the various boats.
As it became clear the ship was going down, panic set in. Chaos and crowds threatened to overwhelm the Addergoole 14 as they fought their way to the lifeboat decks.
When they got to the last boat, which was lifeboat 16, and Kate Kelly got into that lifeboat.
In a way, it was a wonderful thing for us that Annie Kate got on. Because all the little stories, all the little bits and pieces that we know about the Titanic all came from Annie Kate.
And the last sight she saw was of Pat was waving goodbye to her with his rosary beads in his hand. That's the picture that's in the window, yes.
The scene was so horrifying that Annie Kate Kelly is said to have been haunted As the ship went down, it changed the direction of her life forever. In 1994, a leather satchel was retrieved from the debris field surrounding the wreck site. Conservation experts carefully worked on the objects found inside the satchel. They finally revealed the story of one couple's journey around the world. These documents also revealed that the couple's true relationship may have been considerably different than what they had led others on board to believe.
George Rosenshine and Gertrude Mabel Thorne, a very interesting couple, and they certainly were a couple, but they were not married as the fact they was travelling under Mabel's name would suggest. They were both travelling under the name of Thorne.
This document is from Thomas Cook & Son, who was the travel agent for George Rosenshine and Mabel Thorne. And it's from Yokohama, where they created their itineraries for the rest of their around the world tour.
It's very interesting that the paper survived, but we're very happy that it did. Number one, the paper at that time was rag paper, or better quality paper, so that helped a lot. Number two, it was recovered in leather suitcases, and the leather suitcases tended to protect the paper from the bacterial or microbial communities at the bottom of the ocean. It was very deep and dark and cold, which is another way to preserve organic material.
And we have a letter from his brother on Rosenshine Brothers Stationery. And that was the business that the three brothers had, which was started by their father. Just saying family things like, we received your letters, here's one to you, we're all glad you're having a wonderful time.
Thanks to the recovery and preservation of these documents, the exciting travels of these mysterious lovers was revealed.
He was a successful businessman, and she was a woman who loved travel, and so the two of them had just enjoyed a fantastic trip overseas where they'd taken in India and Japan and had, I think, thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. And I think the suggestions are that they were very much in love.
The question is, however, if they were in love, why were they defying the Edwardian conventions of the day? Why weren't they married?
This is a curious question because as far as we know, at the time they joined Titanic, there was no obstacle. She had been married, but she, as far as we know, was no longer married. But that might have previously been a complication. There's also the factor that we're looking at an interfaith relationship, and it could be that his mother objected to him marrying out of the Jewish faith.
George and Mabel were not the only unmarried couple traveling together on the ship.
If you look at the passenger list of the Titanic, we find several instances in which there are couples either travelling as a married couple or of men who have installed their mistresses in separate cabins. And if we take that as a typical cross-section of people who were crossing the Atlantic, it seems that we see it in all three classes.
So it was a subterfuge, but it wasn't really a huge secret, other than, of course, they wouldn't tell everyone on board ship that they weren't married. They traveled as Mr. and Mrs. Thorne.
At approximately 11:40 on April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg a few hundred miles off the coast of Newfoundland.
Like the majority of women who travelled first class, Mabel survived, but her partner, George, like many of the first class male passengers, did not. The telegram to George's brother that Mabel sent would suggest that Mabel was familiar with his family and in particular with his brother.
Pray God George was rescued by another boat with the rest of the men. Arrive Carpathia. Mabel Thorne.
And then I think the other telegram was to her sister, her own sister, in which she doesn't talk about George. So that may imply that her family was not aware of the relationship.
am safe. Arrive on Cunard, Carpathia. Gertrude.
Mabel survived, but what about the other female first-class passengers? Did they all survive?
Of the 144 first-class women aboard, only 4 perished in the disaster. One of the women who perished was Isidor Straus. I think the story of Isidor Straus is one of the most bittersweet stories of the Titanic that we know of, because she was on the verge of boarding a lifeboat.
Surrounded by chaos, shouting voices, and panic, Isidor Straus stepped into a lifeboat, and yet she died. What happened to the beloved wife of Isidor Straus in the last moments of Titanic's life? Many stories have been passed down through the generations about the tragic events that unfolded after Titanic hit the iceberg. Survivors' accounts are varied and often conflict with one another. But one story that's always the same is the bittersweet tale of the final moments of Ida and Isidor Straus.
When word came down to evacuate the ship, response was mixed. It mostly depended on where you were in the ship. For instance, first class was fairly far removed from the seat of impact. Many people said they didn't feel anything. Many first class passengers were reluctant to actually evacuate. Titanic was warm and steady, and the lights didn't even blink. The feeling was, in many cases, it's the officers being overly protective, overly judicious. Now, in third class, where you're much closer to the impact, it was rather different. The ship actually did rattle, and many third-class passengers, especially in the forward end of the ship, were very much aware that something was wrong, and they were very anxious to make their way to the top deck. Women and children first was a long-standing tradition. It's not codified anywhere. It was just the way gentlemen were expected to behave. It's no miracle that most first-class women survived. The lifeboats were on the first-class deck. Everybody knew how to get up to them, so most of them survived. Now, 4 first-class women did not survive. The most famous of these is Isidor Straus.
When Titanic sank, they sent up flares and they sent out radio signals. And as it happened, there was a ship called Carpathia that was traveling in the other direction. And aboard the ship was a grocery buyer from Macy's called John Badenoch.
Dear Mr. Percy, as per your request, I submit herewith the facts as desired.
He wrote a very lengthy letter to one of the sons, Percy, describing the scene.
Realizing how anxious you would be to get the most accurate information about the last that was seen of your father and mother, I circulated among the survivors.
From this, we have really a very good understanding of what happened aboard Titanic in the very last moments with regard to the Strauses.
Ida entered one of the lifeboats, expecting that her husband would join her. She turned around and found that he was not coming into the lifeboat. She said, "Please, Isidor," and he said, "No, it's women and children first." She then said, "If you are not going to be in the lifeboat, I shall not be in the lifeboat. We have lived a wonderful life together, and in keeping with the spirit of the Book of Ruth, where thou go, I go, and if need be, we will perish together."
Your mother was asked by the officer in charge and urged by your father to get in one of the lifeboats. She refused to do so and insisted that the maid take her place in boat number 8.
She saw her maid and said, "Ellen, you must now get in to the lifeboat, but you will be cold in these frigid iceberg-laden seas. I have no further need for this fur coat. And let me give it to you to keep you warm in the lifeboat until you're rescued." She had lived this wonderful life with Isidor, who loved her as much as she loved him, and that as they had lived their lives, together so they would perish together, in love, in each other's arms.
Your father and mother then walked to the opposite side of the ship, and when last seen were standing, clasped in each other's arms, calmly awaiting for any help that might come.
That form of death, I think, has not only perhaps a generosity, but to me, simply a beauty to it.
A lot of people died that night. I think you'd be very sorry to see a soul like Mrs. Straus go with them.
So Ellen Burr did survive, and after she came to New York, she brought the coat to their eldest daughter.
And that would be Sarah Straus Hess, my grandmother. And I remember I said to my grandmother, "So what did you say to Ellen?" And she said, "My mother gave this coat to you. This coat is yours. I want you to have it in my mother's memory."
Word didn't get back for way over a week later.
My relative was Annie McGowan. She was a cousin of my mother's. She got on a lifeboat, and she was lucky to be saved.
Of the 14 people who left from Addergoole, 11 died in the disaster and only 3 survived. The tragedy had long-term effects on the community.
It was an awful blow. My uncle, he never wanted to hear anything about the Titanic afterwards. Like if there was any mention of it, you could see the sadness in his face and his eyes would well up with tears. He didn't want to hear it. And that was the feeling all over.
Well, my grandmother was Pat's mother. When she went to bed, she was so depressed that she was in bed for a week or so after.
Of the 3 survivors, Annie Kate Kelly was the only one who ever returned to Ireland. After the disaster, she joined her sister and cousins in Chicago, where she became a nun and devoted her life to service. To honor their unique connection to the tragedy, the parish of Addergoole erected this memorial park in time for the 100th anniversary of Titanic's sinking.
It was traumatic. And that is why the Titanic Society was formed here in Athergole, that collectively, as a community, would remember those 14 people. Now, everything which was built here in the Memorial Park was built from stones from the homes of the 14 people.
After my great-grandparents died, a memorial service was held for them in the city. The turnout was so great, they simply could not accommodate everyone who wanted to be there. And thousands came to pay tribute to my great-grandparents.
To me, what's really dramatic is that if you research the outpouring of New York society when learning of their deaths, it's amazing. Every group that they ever gave money to, all their employees, everyone wrote to the family to express their grief over having lost this wonderful couple.
In Macy's, a plaque was erected by the employees, and this is the beautiful part. It was not by the members of the board of directors, it was not by shareholders. It's the employees through their employee association, with literally nickels and dimes, who raised the money to have a plaque of Isidor and Ida to be placed in the main entrance on 34th Street.
Dr. Paul Nolan came up with the idea of having an annual bell-ringing ceremony to remember the Addergoole 14 while sitting in the pub.
So I went across, got a ladder and got a rope, came around, and eventually got the ladder up and tied it on there and fell down off my back and all that. And then said, bugger this, so I pulled it a few times and it rang. So then I went back into the two pubs. I says, come on, we're all going to come up with me and we're going to ring a bell. We're going to ring a bell and we're going to have the noise going across the whole lake and around the mountain. We're going to ring the bell. This is our day.
Internationally recognized Titanic expert Alex Klingelhofer has traveled to Ireland to share artifacts recovered from the Titanic wreck site with relatives of the Addergoole 14.
Thank you for coming this evening. It's my pleasure to be here. And I have one artifact that I brought that shows the extension of the Irish culture throughout the world. So it's a small little piece of art pottery. It has the shamrock on it. And so I thought that would be at least speaking to the Irish culture that so changed the world. I mean, I know in America, where I'm from, the Irish started coming in the mid-19th century, and they really changed the landscape of our culture, and so they're very important to us. So I was trying to think of something that would really speak to the 14. So I thought about their daily lives. What did they do every day? They had tea. What did they do on Titanic? They had tea. These are third-class teacups. It's just a cup, but it can remind us of the larger story of the Addergoole 14. Maybe one of your people held this. Maybe one of your people drank from it. You are keeping these stories alive, and therefore the legacy of Titanic alive, and that's important. And I'm glad you all came together because learning from you about the 14 who were on Titanic. It's important. They're not just names on a memorial wall, but they actually have some sort of view of their life behind that name.
No other place in the world suffered such a great loss in the Titanic as did this parish here, in the parish of Addergoole. And that is why they are remembered by the community now every year. It was such a sad, terrible thing to happen that each family lost a relative, was absolutely saddened. But then some years ago, we came together and formed the society. The whole community now expresses their loss.
Memorials like these have played an important role to honor and remember those who were lost on Titanic.
Boats went out and recovered many of the bodies that were floating on the sea, including my great-grandfather Isidor's, but they did not ever recover Ida's body. Isidor was brought back, and they found in the vest that he was wearing a locket. And that locket was given to my mother, who in turn gave it to me. It's a small locket that is gold with an onyx face with the initials I.S. Isidor Straus engraved. Inside the locket, two pictures. One of his eldest son, Jesse, and one of his eldest daughter, Sarah, my grandmother. And this will remain as an item by promise throughout the generations of our family. People have sometimes asked me, if it were you, would you have made the decision that Isidor did? And I have to say, I don't know, but I'd like to think I would.
Oh, the water is black, and my heart is somewhere in the sea.
Well, tonight, a group of people will get together at about 2 o'clock in the morning.
On the night tide, Titanic sailed.
There'll be a candlelight procession right round the church.
Sat by the fireside.
There'll be a few words spoken, few prayers said to remember those people who were so tragically lost.
My love waits for me.
Now, the ship was sinking from 2:20 until 2:45. So the relatives of the 11 who were lost will each go to the church bell.
Firstly, I would like to call on Frank Gibbons, who will toll the bell for John Burke. I invite Tommy Canavan to ring the bell for Pat Canavan.
Now, that has been done every year for quite a number of years. And hopefully that the community will continue to do that and remember those people for many years to come.
The sinking of RMS Titanic is distant history, yet to some, it is as relevant today as love. You see, love and the loss of love has no expiry date. This collection of artifacts reminds us, inspires us, that in the face of enormous tragedy, in the end, love is what remains. Titanic lookout Frederick Fleet survived the disaster. So why did he come to a terrible end? What is the heartbreaking story of the man who spotted the iceberg? And who were the seemingly orphan children saved in the last lifeboat? Where were their parents? Then there is the fascinating story of the man at the wheel when the ship hit the iceberg. The tragic journey of Robert Hitchens. All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep. It's the year 2000. In the North Atlantic Ocean, 12,500 feet below the surface, Russian submersible Mir 1 scans the debris field of the Titanic. Previous dives had found artifacts representing key moments from the night of the sinking. The crow's nest bell, which rang 3 times after spotting the iceberg, and the crow's nest telephone, which was used to communicate this danger to the bridge. Amongst the sand and debris, Mir 1 spots a metal object. It's revealed to be a brass steering stand. At a stand like this one stood Quartermaster Robert Hitchens. that night of April 14th, 1912, turning the wheel hard to starboard, attempting to outmaneuver a deadly iceberg. Hitchens' attempt to evade the iceberg's path proved futile. Only 37 seconds after the infamous words, "iceberg right ahead," the Titanic's fate was sealed. World-renowned Titanic conservator Alex Klingelhofer describes the journey the steering stand took from the bottom of the ocean to this top-secret warehouse in Atlanta.
This artifact was brought to the surface and then conserved and treated. The piece itself weighs about 80 pounds. This is made out of bronze. This piece would have been vertical. So the wheel would have been attached here, and the quartermaster would have stood here. And basically, he's in charge of the helm, so he's the one that's controlling where the ship goes.
For some crew members, the decisions they made would be forever tried in the court of public opinion. And few people in Titanic lore are as controversial as Quartermaster Robert Hitchens.
He was the man that was at the ship's wheel during the collision, which is the biggest reason that people recognize him. And then the second biggest reason would be the fame of his interactions with Molly Brown, the lifeboat.
Margaret, or Molly Brown, was a socialite traveling without her husband. Following the tragedy, she became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. As Titanic was being evacuated, she was seated in Lifeboat 6. After the iceberg was struck, Hitchens was sent to help with evacuations. He was put in charge of Lifeboat number 6.
Captain Smith, at some point along the way into the sinking, had a megaphone and tried calling some of the lifeboats that were only partially filled back to the ship to take on more people. And Hitchens heard this order and refused to go back.
As the Titanic sank, a lot of women in the boats, hearing the cries of distress, wanted to return. And Hitchens, he said, "It's our lives now, not theirs," and was accused of saying that there were only a lot of stiffs back there.
Quite a few of these women in this boat had left their husbands or friends back behind. At that stage, he could have gone back and possibly taken on people safely and refused to do it.
They row away and eventually tie up with boat number 16, rafting together. Hitchens then stood down from his station and prepared to take a rest. As soon as they stopped rowing, the women in the boats began to chill down and they found the cold intolerable and they wanted to resume rowing so they could remain warm. Hitchens objected. Margaret Brown, absolutely incensed.
She threatened him and said, "We're going to do this anyways, and if you try to stop me, I'm going to throw you overboard."
One of the women had to put their hand on Margaret's shoulder to try and settle her down, but she said later, "Oh no, if I tried to advance on him, he was so terrified of me, he would have gone overboard."
You know, you've got Molly Brown, she's on the stage in books or mugs, and everybody loves her and sees her as this incredible heroine. And Robert Hitchens is this terrible bully, and it's not true.
The first ship to respond to Titanic's rescue call was the RMS Carpathia. A flare from a lifeboat in the distance caught the crew's attention, and Carpathia spent the rest of the night picking up passengers from the lifeboats. At approximately 8 a.m., Lifeboat number 6 rowed up to the Carpathia, one of the last to be rescued.
It was a wonderful scene on the Carpathia where Margaret Brown and some of the other passengers of Lifeboat number 6 come across Hitchens apparently gesticulating wildly and talking about the difficulties he had in installing discipline in his lifeboat. And of course, he looked up and saw Margaret Brown and her little entourage, and at that point he beat a hasty retreat.
Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nielsen, began her research into Hitchens' life as a young girl.
I was 14 and I hadn't heard about Robert Hitchens. My grandfather, Alf, he'd be sat in a corner with his woodbines and his pale ale. And I was just sat talking to him one day and he said, "Did you know your great-grandfather, he was at the wheel of the Titanic when it hit the iceberg?" And I thought, well, that is an amazing story. So I started getting interested. And then I suddenly thought, we're going to be 2012 soon. Nothing's really been written about my great-grandfather, and his story has been so one-sided.
Before the 100th anniversary of the sinking, Sally published a book, The Man Who Sank Titanic.
I thought, somebody's got to tell the story, and it's going to be me. Robert was born in New Lynn. He went out to sea when he was 14. Robert said, I want to make something of myself, and so he said goodbye to his family, and he joined the Royal Naval Reserves, and he becomes a quartermaster. Quartermaster has quite a lot of duties, but of course they steer the ship. It was while he was on shore leave that he met a farm labourer's daughter, and her name was Florence Mortimer. And he fell in love, love blossomed, and they got married in about 1906. And it was 1910 that Robert decided, I need to further my career now, and I want to be on the big liners. And the nearest port was Southampton. Southampton was a bustling sea town. It didn't become a city until the 60s. This wall shows all the 900 crew that were on Titanic, and there's hardly any photos. I'm just trying to find Robert Hitchens here, actually. And there were only about 165 who did survive. There he is. 1912, it was a terrible time. There were the coal strikes. Anything that ran on coal, so specifically the steamships were having a terrible time. So every single crewman was trying to get on a ship. When the coal strike was lifted on the 6th of April, they went charging down to the signing on offices to try and get on this fantastic ship that they'd heard about. He was 29 when he signed up at Southampton on the 6th of April. The paint was hardly even dry when Titanic came to Southampton from Belfast. Robert went down there with hundreds of other hopefuls, and he was the second quartermaster, actually, to sign up after the officers. The coal strike had meant that Southampton had been in terrible poverty, and now, at last, he had a berth on a ship and an opportunity to make some money. He was 12 years as a quartermaster before he went on Titanic. And Titanic was going to be the first ship that he was to sail on with the White Star Line. Florence, his beloved wife, she was 6 months pregnant with my grandmother, Phyllis May. And his parents and his family were so proud that he was going to be sailing on this fantastic luxury liner. It was just terribly, terribly exciting.
In the port city of Southampton, England, Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nielsen, visits berth 44.
There would have been a very big terminal building. It's changed so much.
At noon on April 10th, 1912, Titanic departed from this spot on her maiden voyage to New York.
If I imagine really, really hard, I can see the bands and all the passengers throwing all the roses over the boat deck of the Titanic, and the whistles blowing. And I imagine the huge, great, heavy bronze propellers turning. Yeah, I can definitely imagine it.
Riding in the lap of luxury, it had been 4 days of smooth sailing for the passengers of Titanic. Cruising along at a brisk speed of 23 knots, Titanic had, so far, lived up to the hype of her launch. But on the morning of April 14th, a series of troubling telegrams were received.
Days leading up to Titanic, there were so many reports of ships getting stuck in ice. It's all different types of icebergs. So they were heading at 22.5 knots towards a known ice field. Sunday, the 14th of April, and Robert Hitchens starts the shift at 8 o'clock. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were up in the crow's nest, which is just in front of the pilot house, 50 feet up, and Robert was at the wheel. So Robert Hitchens is at the wheel and he hears a bell. 3 loud gongs of the bell up from the crow's nest. All of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. Moody comes racing into the wheelhouse. The phone rings. He picks up the phone and he says, "What do you see?" And from the crow's nest, it would be ice dead ahead. And then William Murdoch says, "Ice dead ahead, hard a starboard." And it's at that point that Robert Hitchens flings the wheel to the left. And it was as Robert Hitchens was just going 2 points to try and steer to port again that they hit.
As Titanic turned to port, it very nearly avoided the iceberg altogether. In fact, the collision was along the starboard side at intermittent intervals. But the pressure of the berg against the hull plates caused them to buckle and open to the sea, which of course allowed the ingress of water. Once they breached 6 watertight compartments, it was inevitable that the ship would sink.
Captain Smith comes out at that point from his cabin and he says, "What have we hit?" So Murdoch says, "We've hit an iceberg. You know, I hard starboarded, I tried to port round her, but it was too late. We already hit."
This is the crow's nest bell, rung by 24-year-old lookout Frederick Fleet after spotting the iceberg. Fleet and shift partner Reginald Lee started their watch in the crow's nest at 10 p.m. It was a clear, starry night. The water was still, no chop. One witness described it as looking at a sea of glass. It wasn't until 11:39 p.m. when Fleet first glimpsed the large black mass in their path.
It was the beautifulest night I'd ever seen. The stars were like lamps. I saw this black thing looming up. I didn't know what it was. I asked Lee if he knew what it was. He couldn't say. I thought I'd better ring the bell. I rang it 3 times. We watched the thing. It had a pointed top. We didn't like the look of this thing.
After ringing the bell, Fleet picked up this phone and called the wheelhouse, where 6th Officer James Moody answered the call. Iceberg right ahead. The officers had only 37 seconds to act. About 20 minutes after impact, Frederick Fleet ended his shift in the crow's nest. He was sent down to the boat deck to help with evacuations and directed to assist Quartermaster Robert Hitchens in loading passengers safely into lifeboat number 6.
Robert had 25 in his lifeboat, 21 women and 4 men. It was really difficult because they're big, heavy wooden lifeboats. And Robert Hitchens said, "Take an oar, ladies and oar, do your best." And then they rowed and rowed as hard as they could so that they were nearly a mile away from the Titanic. And then they looked back. And they could see the Titanic upend and go into the water. It must have been the most horrific thing for all of them to have seen. Absolutely terrible. It was that got the women to trying to persuade Robert Hitchens to go back for survivors. They could hear the moaning in the water. This is where Robert Hitchens' reputation was absolutely ruined. This is the whole point of the story and me wanting to tell his story, because one of the passengers was Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown. And later on, Robert would say, this woman, she could have gone into any lifeboat. Why, oh, why did she come into mine? They were all in terrible shock. You know, the women, they had husbands on board the Titanic. But Molly Brown was on her own. She didn't have her husband and her children on the ship. So she took charge because she could. You know, she was a socialite. She was a woman that got things done, and she was loud. She was saying, go back for survivors. And Robert was saying, no, he knows how cold the water is. He knows about hypothermia. He knows that if you go in the water, you're not going to survive. I have no doubt that Robert used, you know, quite flowery language. I don't know exactly what he would have said. And somebody said Molly Brown was even trying to sort of climb over and get to the tiller. But if you'd just been at the helm of a major luxury unsinkable liner and it had hit an iceberg, how would you be feeling? There was no way he was going to let go of that tiller. He was probably in terrible shock. They were saying that he was quivering like an aspen. He just had an overcoat on, he had no hat. He'd been standing up, his lips were getting frostbitten. He wanted to make sure that he could steer these people to safety. Passengers within the lifeboat were calling him a bully, and they were saying he was a coward because he didn't go back for survivors. And that is it. That was his reputation for 100 years, that he was a coward and a bully. They wanted someone to blame. That was it. And Robert was the one.
Almost an hour after Robert Hitchens' Lifeboat No. 6 launched successfully from Titanic, the lifeboat Collapsible D is lowered down from the roof of the officers' quarters. There were 4 collapsible lifeboats on the Titanic, launched after the 16 standard wooden lifeboats were deployed. With 1,500 people still aboard, and only a 47-passenger limit on Collapsible D, crew members form a circle around it to ensure only women and children get on board. All of a sudden, a Frenchman breaks through the human barrier with 2 small boys in hand. They're safely placed aboard, and Collapsible D launches from the port side. It would be the last lifeboat to leave successfully. When the Carpathia came to their rescue, the boys spoke no English and didn't know the names of their parents. When they got to New York, the newspapers proclaimed them the Titanic orphans. Who were these children? The range of artifacts recovered from Titanic's resting place can lead us to contemplate some of the saddest aspects of the tragedy. These are some clay marbles found at the debris site. One can imagine children rolling them down the Titanic's long promenade decks. There were 126 children aboard Titanic under the age of 14, and almost half of them would perish the night of the sinking. The so-called Titanic orphans would survive the tragedy. In Paris, France, Elisabeth Navratil discusses her connection to one of the biggest mysteries of the Titanic story.
Quand j'étais jeune, donc, nous vivions à Montpellier, et une nuit, j'entends mes parents parler et j'entends le mot Titanic. J'ai dit, mais de quoi vous parlez? Ils ont hésité, et puis papa a décidé de me raconter ce qui s'était passé. Et tout d'un coup, j'ai compris pourquoi mon grand-père était mort.
Mon grand-père, Michel Navratil,
il fait un apprentissage de couture à Vienne. Et ensuite, il va se perfectionner à Paris. Et ensuite, il est engagé par le meilleur tailleur de Nice. Et il devient le premier tailleur. Là, il y a une jeune fille qui est apprentie couturière, Marcel. Il tombe immédiatement amoureux de cette jeune fille et elle de lui. Ils se marient, ils ont 2 ans de bonheur, mais aussi ils ne s'entendent pas sur tous les points.
The couple has 2 children in quick succession, but their relationship starts to break down.
C'est Marcel et les 2 enfants, l'année où elle est infidèle, je pense. Quand Michel apprend qu'il est trompé par son meilleur ami avec sa femme, il devient fou de colère et fou de désespoir.
Michel, in a fit of rage, decides to end his marriage and immigrate to Chicago, where he has family, and takes his children with him.
Il ne peut pas imaginer de laisser ses enfants à Marseille. Il est allé à Monte-Carlo acheter 3 billets de seconde classe sur le Titanic. Et il s'est inscrit sous le nom de son ami Michel Hoffman. Ensuite, il va à Southampton directement parce qu'il a peur d'être arrêté par la police.
Michel Navratil has kidnapped his 2 young sons and fled France. Years later, Michel's eldest son, Michel Marcel Navratil Jr., wrote down his memories of escaping the sinking ship.
Je fus réveillée par mon père. Il me porta dans ses bras sur le pont du Titanic, puis tous deux nous placèrent, mon frère et moi, dans un canot qui était déjà à peu près pleine de passagers. Mon père me chargea de dire à ma mère l'affection qu'il avait pour elle, et il nous quitta. Je ne savais pas que je ne le reverrais plus. Je me souviens des moments où la barque fut descendue du Titanic, du bruit qu'elle fit en tombant dans l'eau, et des moments où elle commença à s'éloigner du navire. Je me souviens de mon réveil dans la barque, après que je me sois endormie. La mer était blanchâtre, presque livide, et il y avait un navire à distance. C'était le Carpathia.
Once aboard the rescue ship, no one could figure out who the children were or where their parents may be.
Les enfants ne connaissent pas leur nom de famille. Ils ne connaissent même pas leur prénom parce qu'on les appelle Lolo pour Michel et Moumou pour Edmond.
It was impossible for the authorities to determine who they were and if they had any living relatives. Numerous stories and photos of the boys appeared in newspapers around the world, creating an international mystery. In the meantime, their mother had no clue where they were.
Au bout de 5 jours, après le naufrage, elle voit sur le journal de Nice la photo en grand de ses enfants, rescapés du Titanic. Voilà.
Marcel convinces the White Star Line to give her a ticket to New York, and she sets off to reunite with her children.
Lorsqu'elle arrive là-bas, à la Children's Aid Society, elle entre, les enfants sont à l'autre bout, en train de jouer, et puis il la voit, et tout le monde court, et ils se rejoignent au centre. Et là, c'est des baisers, des mamans et des mamans. Bon, bref. Ça y est, on lui rend ses enfants. Voilà.
Michel Navratil Sr., the young boy's father, perished in the sinking. His body was recovered and he was buried in a Halifax cemetery, along with many others from the maritime disaster. Elizabeth's father, Michel Marcel Navratil Jr., died in 2001 at the age of 92. He was the last living male survivor of Titanic. After the rescue, survivors were brought back to New York. United States Senator William Alden Smith formed an official inquiry into the sinking of Titanic. On day 5 of the proceedings, Robert Hitchens was called to testify.
In the inquiry, he claims nobody asked him to go back to pick anybody out of the water, says he didn't use the term stiffs, that kind of thing.
A lot of his answers when he was challenged on these points seemed to revolve around, well, I don't remember, I don't recall saying that, which of course is classic evasion.
In the age of yellow journalism, and you needed a good story, disreputable reporters would just stitch stories together, and that's what was printed.
Margaret Brown had some very scathing things to say about Hitchens to the press. She talked about him as being craven and wouldn't even call him a man. She considered him the epitome of cowardice.
She was saying all this stuff that he was preaching and quivering and looking terrified, and he was a coward and a bully.
Somebody like Hitchens is just going to take the black eye, because if you start making a stink about it, then the stink becomes the story. What might have been read by a few thousand people in a provincial paper is now read by everybody.
So Robert Hitchens was asked to testify. Once he told the actual story, the timeline of everything that he did, he said, "I do want to add something, sir." You know, he wanted to give his side of the story. People are saying that, you know, I stole all the brandy and I was drunk and that I wouldn't go back for survivors. And that's just not the case. I was given direct orders. I was just doing my job.
Nobody at any point said it was Robert's fault. But if you've been at the helm of a luxury unsinkable liner and it sinks, you know, it was like he had an albatross sitting on his shoulder, and people didn't want to sail with him anymore. So for many years, he did sail a little bit, but on small ships. You know, there were many seamen who they went out to sea all their lives. It was all they knew, and that was certainly Robert. You know, he went out to sea when he was 14, and his whole life he was part of the sea in one continent or another.
Hitchens' life after the Titanic was a troubled one, including time in prison for attempted murder.
We're getting towards the Great Depression, and Florence was running a B&B with her sister in a very posh part of Torquay. So Robert had this boat, but no one had any money. And then they had a really bad summer of rain as well. So Robert wasn't getting any of the people coming on his boat. But he also made a very silly mistake of borrowing some money from a man called Harry Henley. He was not a very likable character. Harry Henley wanted his money back, and he was giving Robert a really, really hard time and bullying him. And Robert was in such a terrible state, he had to sell the house, and he blamed Harry Henley. So he was going to kill Harry Henley, and he was going to kill himself. And he found Harry Henley, and Robert said, "Lend me some money." And Harry Henley said, "If you weren't so drunk, I'd beat you up." So Robert Hitchens reached into his pocket and he took out the gun, this small silver revolver, and he shot him.
The shot barely grazed Henley's skull, and a second shot missed completely. Henley escaped and ran to the police. Hitchens tried to end his own life, but that shot missed as well.
But because of his excellent war record and the fact that he was on the Titanic and he was down and out, he didn't get the hangman noose. But he was given 5 years at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight.
Even after his release from prison, Robert Hitchens' struggles continued.
Florence was suffering with headaches, and she was diagnosed with a brain tumor.
She died in early 1940.
Robert went to Liverpool and picked up the English trader and took his last trip. And he was telling crewmen on the English trader, "I won't see England again. I want to be with Florence." And, you know, Robert died on the 23rd of September.
His family never found out where he was buried, but it was assumed he was buried at sea.
There's a wonderful photograph of him on the beach with Florence and her sister. You can see how much taller she is than him. Robert's standing there with the pipe. And I love that photograph. That is the... You see, that's right. That's what gets me. Sorry, because that's Robert. I just see him. I see him. It's like he's standing in front of me when I see that photo. You know, that is the kind, caring Robert. You know, he's probably got a great sense of humour, and the one that his parents loved and, you know, everyone else seemed to love, except for the people that were in the lifeboat.
At the Senate inquiry in New York after the sinking, the young lookout who spotted the iceberg, Frederick Fleet, was also called to testify. His answers were terse and short.
Every crew member who survived faced questioning to some degree or another. It might have been more acute in his case just simply because of the position he occupied, the position he was in when the collision occurred.
The questions are pretty straightforward, most of them what he's asking, but it did seem like he was being maybe slightly evasive or at least defensive in his responses. When they asked, how quickly did you see that? He's like, well, I told him about it as soon as I saw it. And you could tell he didn't want to get blamed about not reporting it soon enough.
They've just experienced the most catastrophic accident that the North Atlantic has ever seen. And he was the lookout. I think it's very natural that you would feel defensive. You would feel very vulnerable in that position. But he was a sensitive soul, and I think he might have read as criticism what wasn't necessarily intended as criticism.
Questions started to arise as to why the lookouts weren't equipped with binoculars, or glasses, as they were then called.
Will you tell me how long have you been of the rank of lookout? How long have you held that position?
About 4 years. All the time I was in the Oceanic.
When you were in the Oceanic and employed there as a lookout, did you have glasses?
Yes.
Glasses provided for you in the crow's nest?
Yes, every trip.
Did you ask for glasses?
I did not, but Simmons did.
You had better tell us what he said.
He said there were none aboard for us.
There could very well have been a set of binoculars in the crow's nest locker. The trouble was, the door was locked, and the man who had the key had been let go.
Now, we know that they did have binoculars when they brought Titanic from Belfast to Southampton.
One officer was placed in charge of the binoculars in a locked cabinet. You would always keep everything locked. But the last day before they set sail, there was a change in the order of the officers.
David Blair, the second officer, left the ship in Southampton. There was a reshuffle. A new chief officer was brought on board. He left the ship with the key to the crow's nest box in his pocket.
Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, normally they would have taken binoculars with them, but there were none to be provided because they were locked up and unavailable to them.
Do you think if you had had glasses, you could have seen the iceberg sooner?
Certainly.
How much sooner do you think you could have seen it?
In time for the ship to get out of the way.
So it is your view that if you had had glasses, it would have made all the difference between safety and disaster?
Yes.
Fleet's explosive claim that binoculars could have changed Titanic's fate caused a stir. But whether it's actually true has been hotly debated by historians.
Experienced merchant seamen themselves couldn't agree on the merits of carrying binoculars.
Some lookouts favored having binoculars, but a lot of them didn't like using them, especially at night.
Binoculars magnified the object they were looking at, but of course they restricted your field of view. So in the view of some merchant mariners, it was better to have a clear, unencumbered view of the horizon.
Apparently, Admiral Scott of Antarctica said that no, actually, in his opinion, being on the deck with binoculars would have been much better to observe an iceberg in those conditions. But to be honest, no one will ever know. Just the fact that there weren't binoculars and that Frederick Fleet saw the absence of stars and rang the bell and said iceberg straight ahead.
After the disaster, Frederick Fleet had trouble finding steady work aboard other ships. There were numerous rumors that perhaps Titanic's crew were bad luck.
After the Titanic, he kind of felt that he had gotten a raw deal because of his affiliation with the sinking, and I think a lot of the crew members felt that way, that maybe they got kind of passed out because they didn't want reminders about the sinking.
There are some indications that there was a certain stigma with having been a Titanic crewman. I interviewed the son of a White Star Line steward who said that in the 1930s there was a suggestion that the careers, at least of the Titanic's officers, had been stymied.
Fleet's life didn't get easier in the ensuing years. The memories of the tragedy still haunted him.
Frederick Fleet struggled for many years after the Titanic disaster. He had insomnia. He spoke years later of the continuing nightmare of seeing this giant dark shape looming out of the dark. What we know now about survivor's guilt is that regardless of what your roles or responsibilities are, just by virtue of the fact that you survive can leave you riddled with feelings of guilt. He spent the last days of his life selling newspapers in Southampton. He met an extremely unfortunate end. His beloved wife, Eva, died. He was already struggling. They'd been living in his brother-in-law's house. Upon the death of his wife, he was evicted.
So he was destitute and poor. He was corresponding with Ed Commuta from Titanic Historical Society and had actually kind of talked about these bad circumstances in his life and how hard off he was at that point.
My dear friend, just a few lines to let you know I'm in deep trouble. I have just lost my wife. Also, I'm leaving my house, the place where I have been living. There is only my brother-in-law and myself. We cannot agree, so I think it is to let you know not to write me until I give you my new address.
Within a week, he had snuck back into his old home and he hanged himself in the backyard. I think the Titanic followed him his whole life. Right up to the time he died, he felt very keenly that the Titanic followed him to his grave.
The really horrible thing is that when he died, because he was so poor, he was buried in a pauper's grave, was unmarked.
But in 1993, Ed Commuta and the Titanic Historical Society raised funds to have a tombstone erected for Fleet at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton. In Aberdeen, Scotland, at Trinity Cemetery, Robert Hitchens' great-granddaughter, Sally Nilsson, meets with City Council officer Ian Burnett.
They thought that Robert was buried at sea. They didn't know where he was, and lots of family members tried to find him. They couldn't find him. But then in 2012, 2 weeks before the anniversary, I just thought, I've got to give it my last-ditch attempt to find Robert. And I was calling councils, libraries, everybody.
There were tentacles of information, and I couldn't find it anywhere else. So it was that second phone call when I spoke to Ian, and I said, Ian, please, can you just have one more look?
I didn't even know who Robert Hitchens was, you know, I mean, I just said that I couldn't find him. And then she come back, and then she said to me, do you know who he was? You know, and I said, no, and that's where she told me it was the helmsman of the Titanic, you know.
You phoned me, and you said something on the lines of, Sally, you're not going to believe this.
Yeah.
And I said, what? And you said, I found him.
Yeah.
I think I might burst into tears, actually. You told me that within this little area here, there's 3 seamen.
Yeah, so it's the company that actually bought the grave and paid for the burial for convenience. You know, if they're working for the company, almost a benefit or a perk to get them buried, not in a pauper's grave.
I quite like the idea that Robert's not on his own, though.
Yeah,
he's got some mates down there.
He's got some shipmates down there.
Sally is raising money to erect a proper stone marker. In the meantime, a homemade cross will have to do.
I just really, really hope that he's happy and he's got a little smile on his face, that, you know, some little minion were able to tell the proper story, you know, the real story about Robert Hitchens, that he was just doing his duty. So hopefully, in some small way, I've done it.
In a top-secret warehouse in Atlanta, Sally Nielsen is about to see the brass steering stand recovered from Titanic's wreck site, similar to the one her great-grandfather used on the night of the sinking.
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
You ready for this?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay.
Very excited.
Yes, here we go. Here we are. That's it.
Wow. Oh my gosh, there's wooden spokes out of it as well.
It's amazing that it's still here. Of course, it would have stood about this high, so it would have been quite large. And this is where the wheel would have been.
Yeah.
So your great-grandfather would have stood behind there and turned the wheel.
Oh my
at that point.
God.
And if you notice here, it says port. It's inscribed port.
Oh, yes.
And then there's a bar, and it's starboard over here. And of course, you know, when he did he was asked to turn hard to starboard.
Yeah.
So he would have gone to this direction.
Wow. Just to see this it's such a special thing. I mean, this links me to my great-grandfather and it's too much almost. Yeah. It's funny, sorry.
It's okay.
I knew I'd be emotional about this, but
Of course.
it is just so incredible.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's come from the Titanic. I just feel so completely privileged and grateful. Amazing. Just absolutely amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's
and sharing your story with us.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you.
Titanic's sinking left no mark on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. But in the sea of life, many of her survivors knew the mark of Titanic's sinking until their dying day. It's in their memory and recognizing the pain they suffered that we dedicate this episode. Documents found in a leather suitcase recovered from the wreck site of RMS Titanic revealed that the suitcase belonged to a man named Howard Irwin, yet no one named Howard Irwin is listed on the passenger manifest. Then there are the school books of Edgar Samuel Andrew and the chilling statement he wrote in a letter to his friend. Right now, I wish Titanic were lying at the bottom of the sea. All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep.
I think Titanic is a special story and unique because it touched the world. And as the accident and the sinking unfolded, the world was being told about it at the same time.
Marconi's wireless telegraph was relatively new. Ships were now able to communicate with shore. This allowed the news of Titanic's sinking to travel quicker than ever before.
So it's a horrible story. It's a heroic story. It is one that resonated in everybody's minds.
Why is Titanic special? I think that there are several factors here. Number one is you have a ship that has been touted as practically unsinkable for all intents and purposes, sinking on its maiden voyage. You have the almost archetypal idea of hubris in that they were sailing into a known ice field and they had received warnings and proceeded and catastrophe befell them. And I think it's very easy for us to imagine ourselves in those circumstances and to ask ourselves, what would we do? The clock is ticking. Some of us are going to live. Most of us are going to die. What do you do when faced with this situation?
In 1993, a collection of items from a single suitcase was recovered from the debris field surrounding RMS Titanic. There were letters and postcards, a diary, tools, sheet music, and musical instruments. Documents that were incredibly preserved inside a leather case clearly revealed the owner's identity as a young man named Howard Irwin.
The thing about suitcases is, if you're lucky, they contain a name, and you'll know who that person was, and it now puts all these objects into context. When a suitcase is recovered, there's a lot of excitement. Because most cases are made out of leather, that leather contains high amounts of tannin, and the tannin permeates the interior, and this is what allows you to conserve books, papers, letters, postcards. So as soon as it's opened up, you immediately take everything out according to what it is. Is it paper? Is it clothing? Is it metal? Is it a ceramic? You throw it in a catalog, and then all the items are separated, and they begin their conservation regime. And you've got to resist the urge to just open up a book or something like that. It has to go in to conservation absolutely untouched.
All of these intriguing artifacts were carefully conserved and identified by internationally renowned Titanic experts and are stored in this top-secret warehouse here in Atlanta.
For instance, there's the Howard Irwin suitcase. This was full of all kinds of small objects that would be meaningless if they were just found on the bottom of the ocean.
Thanks to the conservation of these objects, Titanic researchers were able to come up with a good picture of who Howard Irwin was.
It was recovered as a suitcase at the bottom of the ocean. However, upon recovery, the leather and probably cardboard of the suitcase collapsed. So all we have are the things that were packed inside of the suitcase. Howard Irwin had been traveling around the world for a couple of years with his good friend Henry Soutall. And they had been across America, they had been to Australia, Bora Bora, Africa, and back to England. Inside the case were musical instruments, lots of sheet music from popular tunes as well as classical tunes, and postcards, letters, belts, because they were trimmers, leather trimmers.
Now, if we just found these tools on the seabed, it would just be tools. But because he was an upholsterer, he specialized in the upholstery of horseless carriages and wagons. All of a sudden, they're just not tools. We now recognize them as leather-working tools.
So all these things give you a good example of the person who's represented by those items in the trunk. And I would say that Howard Irwin was pretty much a bon vivant. Yeah. I would say that he had a more exciting personality than his counterpart Henry, but they got along well, and they worked well together.
A 1997 television special featuring artifacts recovered from the Titanic wreck site included some of these postcards found in Howard Irwin's suitcase. This sparked the beginning of one woman's exciting discovery of her family's unexpected and mysterious connection to Titanic.
We're sitting there in our home on a Sunday afternoon, and they were talking about the artifacts that they had recovered, and they're showing a letter on screen. And when they got down to the end of it, it was signed Mrs. Shuttle. And I kind of almost fell over because it's not a very common name. And then I noticed that at the very bottom of the letter, there was a little blurb that said, Roy sends best wishes. Well, Roy was my ex-husband's grandfather's name. And Pearl, who was also mentioned in the letter, was his great aunt. So I'm sitting there thinking, what is going on? How did this letter get on Titanic? Well, someone finally said, you need to talk to RMS Titanic Incorporated. They're the sovereign possession of the wreck.
Barb eventually makes contact with the man in charge of the artifacts from the recovery expedition.
We found out in that phone conversation that for the year of 1910, Howard had kept a diary that told how he and his friend Henry had left Buffalo to travel across the country and ultimately around the world and then return on Titanic. But before they left, Pearl and Howard met when he was 19 and Pearl Shuttle was 17, and they fell in love. So they were trying to keep this love affair alive. The majority of the letters that were ultimately found were from Pearl.
Pearl Shuttle was a member of a band, and so Pearl would travel with her band and perform throughout the Midwest. And so we have Pearl writing to Howard and saying where she was, that she missed him, why can't he write? Or she would send little postcards that say, you know, you should write me. She's very passionate about him. So obviously, there was a strong love interest there.
Most of her letters were trying to convince him of her love for him. And the very last letter was basically a 7-page letter from Pearl. And the bottom line was, if you don't trust me, then we're done. And we're not going to write anymore.
Barb and her husband ask family members about Pearl and are told that she died in 1927. But it's not known if Pearl and Howard ever reunited or why he wasn't on Titanic.
We know that he's traveling with his friend, Henry Soutall. So we looked up the passenger list, and lo and behold, we found Henry Soutall listed. But no Howard, so we had no idea.
The alphabetical passenger list did not contain the name Howard Irwin. A young Irish woman was also in love at this time. Bertha Mulvihill had left her homeland and immigrated to America a few years earlier. She then came back to Ireland in late 1911 for a surprise visit with her family.
There was 11 in the family. There was 12 altogether. One of them died young. We're standing on the roadway where Bridget's family house, where she was born and reared.
The original Mulvihill home is over 200 years old and has been modified for use as a stable on the family farm.
You can picture the house that the roof was hatched the whole way along. There was 3 rooms. So you had all the boys, all the girls, Mammy and Daddy, and the old woman all in the house. Don't ask me where to put the beds. They were a close family. Even to this day, we all hear about the whole family and what they done and what they did, and you kind of look up to them. They were a real tight, close-knit group of people all together.
Despite having their own farm, the Mulvihills suffered during and after the Great Famine, like much of Ireland.
So during the famine, there was enough food in the country to feed the country, but it was all exported by the landlords on the ships to England, and they let us here in Ireland. They left us to die. Well, they were emigrating for a better life. Here, you couldn't get anywhere, really. You just survived. Where somewhere else, you could get on and have a good life if you worked hard. And that's why a lot of them went to America.
Bertha Mulvihill, there's a whole story about her. She was about 26 years old and had been living in the United States since, I believe, 1906. Ended up working in the Rumford Chemical Works, which is where she met her future husband, a man named Henry Noon, when she was there. Courtship was different than nowadays, but Henry Noon, he had actually bought her several items as an engagement gift. She had a bracelet, a cross, and then she also had an engraved watch. That was a very generous gift to kind of note the occasion. Yeah. And something that's kind of funny is that she liked to pull surprises on people. So in 1911, after she got engaged, she snuck back to Ireland. She bought a ticket on the Lusitania across the Atlantic, didn't tell anybody she was coming, rented this jaunting cart, and came riding back into town, hooping and hollering, yelling that she was back. She had this like larger-than-life persona and really did like pulling surprises like that.
This is all well over 100 years ago now. But yes, her mother and father must have been overwhelmed when she came back. And she knew in her heart and soul the chances of ever seeing Ireland or her mother and father again just wasn't going to happen. That had to be so hard. How you actually dealt with it in your mind and your head, you know, that was difficult.
The greatest loss of life in the Titanic tragedy was amongst third-class passengers. Some survivors reported that third-class passengers were kept from getting up to the lifeboat deck. But even if there was equal access for all, there was only enough space for slightly more than half of the people on board. Did third-class passenger Bertha Mulvihill survive? The class system was very much alive and well at the end of the late Edwardian era in 1912. There was a great divide between the wealthy and the poor. This was reflected in the cost of a ticket for passage on Titanic, which ranged immensely. A first-class ticket could go for up to $870 or £85,000 in today's currency for one of 2 parlor suites featuring their own promenade decks, while the third-class ticket averaged £7, equal to about £681 today.
I'd say most definitely that the class system did exist on Titanic. In first class, we have the Jacobean and Louis XIVs and all this splendour. And then we go down a modified, slightly more simplified version in second class, but still some interesting public spaces. So then, of course, we get into the rather utilitarian third class, where the rivets are exposed. Instead of luxurious wallpapers, we're seeing whitewashed walls. But of course, it was still very much a ship that had multiple purposes. It was not just to cater to businessmen who were accustomed to travelling the North Atlantic and might do so many times. You had, of course, the immigrant trade at the other end, where people were moving to seek the new life in America.
When she went to Ireland to visit her family, Bertha Mulvihill had left her fiancé, Henry Noon, back in America.
Her sister Kitty was going to be married in Ireland, and while she had trepidations about leaving him right before their wedding, she really was homesick. So she took the trip.
And she's there for the fall and through the winter. And at this point, my grandfather's really missing her and wondering if she's going to come back because, you know, it's been a while. And then she really misses him. So one day she was walking through the town of Athlone, and she saw a poster and it said, "The Titanic Maiden Voyage." And she thought to herself, you know what, I think I can take that trip and surprise Henry. So they had to leave from Queenstown, Ireland. Her berth, where she stayed, it's like a little tiny room, and it had bunk beds in it.
While first and second class passengers paid a great deal more for their tickets, it was the large number of third class passengers that were the bread and butter for the White Star Line. And those passengers were well fed on board Titanic.
The food in third class, I think, is really important to understand. It was 3 square meals a day. And oftentimes, the people traveling third class hadn't necessarily had that. They were, many of them, farmers. But these were 3 square meals a day with very hearty food like stews or plum pudding and lots of it. And that was one of the ways they wanted to build their reputation. And they would provide them with postcards that said, "Oh, the food was great. Here's the ship I was on. It's wonderful."
This chef's hat, recovered and conserved by EMG, was owned by one of the many young men who prepared the abundant food on board Titanic.
This hat was recovered from a suitcase, and there were a few odds and ends in it, nothing really very big or identifiable. When this was conserved, we discovered that it was a baker's hat, and it belonged to third-class baker Hine, and he wrote his name in ink on it. So it's very small, but you can just see it there. As a baker, he would have made daily breads, he would have made desserts, possibly plum pudding, all of those things that were part of every single meal. He was originally from London, but had relocated to Southampton and signed on as perhaps one of his first jobs on a ship.
Tragically, Titanic would be William Hine's last job at sea. He and his brother-in-law, who was a fellow crew member, both perished. Their bodies were never recovered. After reading transcripts of the love letters Pearl Shuttle wrote to Howard Irwin, Barb Shuttle is eager to find out more about who they were and what became of them. She also wants to see if she can solve the mystery of how his suitcase got onto the ship without him.
So we decided we were all going to do everything we could to try to figure out what happened. One of the first things was for us to go to Buffalo because we knew that was where Howard and his friend Henry left from. We spent a couple of hours in the Buffalo Library looking through microfiche upon microfiche upon microfiche. Well, what we found was in the Buffalo Inquirer of April 16th, 1912, they actually said that Howard had come home 2 months earlier. And we're thinking, okay, well, that would explain that he wasn't on Titanic But again, we didn't know how true that was or what the situation was.
Or why his suitcase was on Titanic.
We decided we would look in the city directory records and see what we could find. And we found Howard. So we knew he had come back to Buffalo. We didn't know when, we didn't know why, we didn't know how. We were just still baffled.
Barb keeps pursuing the mystery and decides to visit Pearl's hometown to see what clues she can find.
Next day, we went up to Hamilton, Ontario, which is where the letter had been written from, and we knew that the family was buried there. So we went to the cemetery, but we couldn't find Pearl anywhere. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, I found her. There had been just like a little indentation in the ground, and there was Pearl's gravestone. Well, first of all, surprised. We thought she had died in 27, and when we found out it was 1911, it kind of opened all kinds of new possibilities as to what had happened with Howard and Henry. You know, we thought, gosh, if she passed away, maybe he came home to spend time with the family. We didn't know, because at that time, we didn't know what happened to Howard.
On the night of the collision, Bertha Mulvihill was in her third-class berth in the lower levels of the ship.
She was in bed, sound asleep. It was such a jar that she almost fell off the bed, and she knew something was really wrong.
So she pinned the pocket watch inside of her coat. She had her bracelet on that Henry had given her as an engagement present. And she also had her cross and chain on, which was another gift from Henry. Everyone was rushing for the staircase, but someone pushed her backwards and said, no, you can't come up. And she fell and she thinks had broken ribs.
It's quite conceivable she reached the top of the staircase and somebody denied her access. And it might be for any number of reasons. That staircase may have led up into a galley or a blind alley. You can't come in here is not necessarily, we forbid you from coming in because you're third class. It's because there's no exit from this section.
I think for those passengers in that part of the ship, there was a panic because they heard the noise of the collision. They could see water coming into the ship. So they knew it wasn't something minor. They knew there was something serious, even if they didn't know the ship was really going to sink. I think there was a little bit more of a sense of urgency and even like a little bit of panic than there would have been for people that were in different areas of the ship.
At approximately midnight on April 14th, 1912, Captain Smith gives the order to start loading lifeboats. In this age of chivalry, it's women and children first.
Women and children first at the time, it was certainly touted as, you know, one of the great traditions of the sea. But the unfortunate fact is, if you look at a statistical breakdown of shipwrecks up till about that time, women and children fared very badly in shipwrecks for obvious reasons. Women wear restrictive garments. They weren't accustomed to any strenuous athletic endeavour. Children, of course, are extremely vulnerable in a shipwreck. So when a ship goes down, they are often completely at the mercy of the elements, the crew, whether or not they're put in a lifeboat. And it resulted in, statistically, up to the point of the Titanic, your survival chances in either group were very low.
It was pandemonium. People were like pushing and shoving. But there was a sailor that she had met like in the beginning of the Titanic venture, and he really liked her. She was a real pretty girl, and he would come up and sweet talk her. So when they were like trying to get out, she saw that sailor and she said, please help us. And so he knew a way of getting out. So he took her and they went through some passage that they were able to get to the top deck.
She told us about climbing up bolts and cleats.
Which is like a term for a ladder of some kind, which I believe might have been the crew ladder that was leading from A deck up to the top deck.
You have the captain who's on the bridge. Then you have other officers going around performing vital duties. And I think that third class wasn't so much forgotten about. I think the stewards are down there waiting. When do we get word to pass third class up? And that word never came. And so when third class was saved, a lot of times it was through their own personal initiative.
When she arrived on the top of the Titanic deck, it was awash in ice, and she knew at that point it was probably going to go down. And she took off her shoes. She stood up on a railing that was the height of a 3-story building, and in her stocking feet, she jumped off the railing.
In April 2000, another suitcase was recovered from the debris field of Titanic. Again, many personal items and documents were well preserved inside the leather case. Expert conservators and Titanic researchers here at EMG were able to identify and learn a great deal about the suitcase's owner.
When we're able to identify objects that belong to a specific passenger, it's usually because the objects have been recovered from inside a leather suitcase or bag, which protected those items. And in most cases, people wrote their name on things, so it's really exciting.
Most of our books came from a 17-year-old passenger named Edgar Samuel Andrews.
He had his school books, he had letters from his mother, so that was pretty easy to trace.
Edgar Andrew was the son of British expatriates who were living in Argentina. He was born in 1895. He had travelled back to England for his education. He was studying in Bournemouth.
The fact that we have the paper is wonderful. The fact that we still can read the writing is a different factor.
We can see that the printing is still there. It's an English grammar book.
The inks are probably oak gall inks at that point, and so they're very permanent. So they don't wash off like the ink that we use today. And then they also wrote a lot in pencil, and the pencil seems to be retained within the surface of the paper as well.
So you still have staining and the molding. You can see here part of an envelope that was stuck to the top of it. So he had just basically dumped all these things into his suitcase and had finished school, and he was headed out to have fun.
I think the collection of items we have from Edgar Andrew are very interesting and show into his character a little bit. We have another area in another notebook where he is practicing writing his name. I distinctly remember doing that as a teenager. How shall I write it? Shall I write it with a forward slant, with, a more fancy hand? We also have a pair of
formal opera shoes. They look rather feminine.
They're more like a woman's ballet shoe with a grosgrain bow on it. But they were for men and formal occasions where you wouldn't want to wear a boot. And so he had a pair of those, and they were bought at a store in Bournemouth, and the streets, of course, are still the same, so we can identify the store where he bought them, which is kind of fun to do.
He was one of the passengers that was originally booked on the Oceanic, and he was quite disappointed when his sailing plans were disrupted by the coal strike and he had to transfer to the Titanic. It actually meant that he had to leave a week earlier, and he'd been looking forward to meeting a close friend by the name of Josie Cowan, and this meant that the meeting could not take place.
So he boarded the ship, and he sent a famous note.
You figure, Josie, I had to leave on the 17th this month aboard the Oceanic, but due to the coal strike, that steamer cannot depart. So I have to go 1 week earlier on board the Titanic. It really seems unbelievable I have to leave a few days before your arrival, but there's no help for it. I've got to go. You figure, Josie, I'm boarding the greatest steamship in the world, but I don't really feel proud of it at all. Right now, I wish the Titanic were lying at the bottom of the ocean.
Researching these artifacts that belong to people allow me to look into their lives, a little bit into what kind of person they were. He was young, but at 17, you were considered a man of the world as well. He had to go on Titanic instead of his original schedule, and so he missed Josie, and he lost his life.
As far as we know, Edgar Andrews' body was never recovered, or if it was recovered, it has never been identified. Barb Shuttle's journey of uncovering the mystery of what happened between Howard Irwin and Pearl Shuttle came to a conclusion when she made contact with Howard's nephew in Canada. The nephew shared Howard's handwritten memoirs with her. From these, Barb finally learns why Howard wasn't on Titanic.
The night before Titanic sails, April 9th, 1912, Howard decides he's going to go out for a walk and clear his head. As he's walking through the streets of Southampton, he meets up with 10 students from St. Louis. Well, they had spent time in St. Louis, so this was like, kind of a homecoming for him. And they all went to a pub. While they're in the pub, a bar fight breaks out. Howard gets whacked on the head and wakes up the next morning on a tramp steamer bound for the Orient. He's been shanghaied. So here's poor Henry at the dock with all of Howard's things, because he figures Howard's a trustworthy person. He said he was coming. He's going to be here. And Howard never shows up. So Henry gets on the ship with all of Howard's things. And then ultimately, 5 days later, Titanic sinks, and Henry, at 25 years old, loses his life. So we finally figured out who Henry was, and it was just an amazing experience. And that's, I think, when the importance of the artifacts themselves hit us, because without them, had they not brought up this trunk, we wouldn't have known any of this. He's a real person now. He's not just a name on a page. And that's when I think it really hit us. Hang on, I'm sorry. I get emotional, I really do. Sorry. The tramp steamer that Howard was on eventually makes it to Egypt, and that's where he hears what happened to Titanic. And he makes his way back to England, finds out that Harry didn't make it, comes back to the United States. Now he's lost his friend, his best friend. I'm sure at this point, he knows he's lost Pearl. He's lost all of his possessions. He's lost everything. It's got to be devastating to this poor man.
It's a pretty wild tale. Can we believe it? Howard's hometown newspaper reported he'd returned to America 2 months before Titanic set sail, leaving his true whereabouts a mystery to researchers.
Do you know, I can only tell you what I've heard. He did not embark on Titanic. Now, I have read he was shanghaied, which I find kind of hard to believe. I can't tell you anything beyond that other than he was not on board the ship.
But if he had returned 2 months earlier, why was his suitcase on Titanic?
So the story is that Henry was carrying Howard's trunk with him. So it was just a friendly gesture, and that's it.
Sometimes mysteries don't get solved. What we do know is that Howard and Pearl loved each other. Pearl died in 1911, and Henry Soutall perished in the sinking of Titanic. Those who did survive were saved because they made it into a lifeboat. They were the lucky ones, especially considering there were not enough lifeboats on board for all passengers and crew.
The question of lifeboats is one that has become a very strong part of the Titanic mythos, because of course we know that there were only lifeboats for approximately half on board under the best of circumstances. But in fact, the Titanic, under Board of Trade regulations, was oversupplied with lifeboats.
When the ship was approved for sale, the White Star Line had placed on board as many lifeboats as were required by law. Initially, the designer had placed quite a few more lifeboats on board, but then the company started looking at everything and saying, well, there isn't enough place on board now with all these lifeboats for people to promenade or do games, or, it was too cluttered. So the designer was requested to remove lifeboats down to the level that was only required by law, because they never really thought that the lifeboats would be used to save lives. They thought it was merely something to remove a few people if there was an engine problem or something of that nature. They never anticipated that it would be a full-blown saving of lives in the middle of the ocean, and these are the only boats you have. They never thought it would be that.
Third-class passenger Bertha Mulvihill, desperate to survive, fought tooth and nail to make her way up to the lifeboat deck.
By the time they got to the top deck, almost all the lifeboats were gone. And then there was one last lifeboat It was number 15. And so it was starting to be lowered down. And so the sailor said, now, if you want to survive, you got to jump. So she kicked her shoes off and she jumped from the top deck down into the boat. And then everybody started jumping on top of her. So like landing on top of her. She was in like so much pain.
Bertha Mulvihill was already injured. She had injured her ribs and back when she was pushed down those stairs, but this guy landed right on top of her and further injured her, so I can't even imagine.
After that experience, she was adrift in the boat, and of course everyone was afraid of being sucked under by the Titanic as it went down, so the oarsmen were rowing as quickly as they could to get away from the ship, and she remembered the lighted portholes going below the waterline and still being lit.
So when my grandmother was in the lifeboat, she said that she saw the Titanic split in half. You know, everyone all the way up to 1997, they all thought it just sunk. But she said, I saw it split in half. And she said that she saw people, you know, drowning around her. And there was one young woman who had a brother. The brother was down in the water, and the oarsman took the oar and smashed his face in until he, like, sunk under the water. And the woman's trying to pull her brother up into the boat. So it must have just been incredible.
And Lifeboat 15 was one of the most heavily loaded boats. And the edge of the boat was pretty low down towards the water. She was in so much pain and agony from these injuries that she had. She was hanging over the side of the boat. Her hair was actually dangling in the water because she was feeling ill. And she says that it got so cold by morning that her hair had frozen with ice in it.
She spent the evening in a hallucinatory way. She thought icebergs were chasing after her. She saw many horrifying things that night. She was forever scarred by her experience.
Bertha Mulvihill had made it off Titanic and into a lifeboat, but she was suffering greatly, both physically and mentally.
She was at the very edge of the boat hanging in the water. And so she's like, must have been just awful because she had broken ribs and just cold and hungry, and they don't know what's gonna happen to her. And she like said a prayer to the Blessed Mother, and she said, you know, if I survive, I'm gonna name my firstborn Mary. And then early in the morning, she sees green lights on the horizon through the fog. And she says, what's that? To some of the men. It's a rescue ship.
When Carpathia came up in the morning and started taking the survivors out of the lifeboats, Bertha was so weak that she couldn't even climb up the rope ladder. So they looped this rope around her and lifted her up to the gangway. She had injured ribs and back. You can imagine how agonizing that would have been, but she was just incapable of doing it herself.
They came into New York, and she had no idea what was going to happen at that point. But by fate, my grandfather had seen the Providence Journal with a headline, "Survivor of the Titanic being Miss Bertha." So he went and he was walking around, and suddenly they were right next to one another. And my grandmother came up from behind, and she put her hands over his eyes and said, "Guess who?" And they just, you know, that was it. She said, "Take me home." They got on the train, they went back to Providence, and she was able to rally to get married and have a lovely August wedding. But the initial weeks and months afterwards, I think, was a combination of being somewhat shocked. They would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome today. But she was able to have children after the wedding.
Bertha did keep the promise she prayed while on board the lifeboat and named her first child Mary.
And that was my Aunt Mary, who was born in 1914.
She died when she was 73. So I knew her for 12 years before that, and I think she mellowed out. She really suddenly was willing to talk about it, and I think it had a lot to do with the grandchildren. She loved her grandchildren, and I think this was her first coming out as a survivor.
She was one of the lucky ones that came out of the third class and was able to get to the top deck, because like almost a good third of them, I think, all died. They never got out.
This is one of the tragedies, of course. If it had been organised, if they had been mustered in time, if they had time to do it, they could have saved all the women and children and a substantial number of men besides.
She had her very own opinions about the Titanic. She would always say the same thing. I saw the real story, and it wasn't pretty. It was a very nasty, ugly story.
Boarding Titanic, Bertha had engagement gifts given to her by her fiancé, Henry Noon. The stories of Titanic's sinking that Bertha told her grandchildren always included their favorite story about the fate of these 4 precious gifts.
My grandfather, Noon, gave this pocket watch to my grandmother as an engagement gift, along with a gold bracelet and a neck chain with a cross. It's something that was on the Titanic with Bertha Mulvihill. It's something that we treasure. The watch itself is gold, as the other 2 objects. And we're very proud to own these and to have them in our possession. And we're proud to share them with you today.
It's always amazing when you tell someone that your grandmother was on the Titanic, they'll say, well, did she survive? And I'll always say, well, if she didn't, I wouldn't be here.
Barb Shuttle is at EMG's top secret warehouse in Atlanta to get a first-hand look at some precious and never-before-seen letters written to Howard Irwin by Pearl Shuttle. Barb,
Hi.
thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You ready for this?
I think so.
Okay, I'll help you through it. Don't
Okay.
worry, it's gonna be fine.
Okay.
Barb, meet Alex.
Hi, Barb. I'm
Good to
so
meet you.
happy to meet you.
Really?
It's really wonderful to have you here. So I decided to bring out some things for you to see. These are some of the letters that I know Pearl sent to Howard Irwin because they were recovered from his suitcase. And you can see the water stamp from how it was left in the water.
That's fascinating.
These were mostly posted in the U.S., but he kept them with him. That's the key point.
Yeah.
This one, you can see it's very faded, but it was from the Esmond Hotel, and it's in Duluth, Minnesota, because she traveled throughout the Midwest with her band.
Playing her cornet.
Basically, she said, I had your letter, and I ran down. I didn't even take my costume off. I just sat on the seat, ripped it open, and read it. And this is part of a 9-page reply to him.
She was crazy about it.
These are really important because they were sent more frequently than the full letters. And they're just little postcards to remind him that she's here. To my Valentine, just the way the bumblebee loves the honeydew, on the sweetest, fairest flower, that's how I love you, your Slats. And I'm thinking Slats was a slang name for something, because she talked in slang. When you read these letters, a little racy, maybe. It says, hello, Squidgens. See?
Okay.
Hello, Squidgens. Ha ha. Still waiting for a letter.
Oh my God. Okay. Now I'm getting emotional.
Well, that's nice.
It's just,
Great to have this.
you know, it's really emotional. It really is. Just amazing.
Thanks to the recovery and conservation of these artifacts from the Titanic debris field, we know far more about Titanic and those who once sailed on her than we would have otherwise known. Some artifacts reveal answers to long-ago mysteries. Others just create more questions. In this way, Titanic's journey continues. And with every recovered artifact, our connection to this tragedy deepens, and the memories of those who perished on that cold April night live on. There were many heroes the night the Titanic sank, but for some, the greatest of these was Fifth Officer Harold Lowe. What made him a hero? And who was the owner of the black alligator purse recovered from 12,000 feet below the Atlantic Ocean? And what of the steam whistles recovered from the wreck site? Would their voice ever be heard again? All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep. Over 100 years later, Titanic's mysteries still tantalize the world over. There were 4 sets of whistles aboard the Titanic, last sounded at noon on April 14th, 1912. This set was the only one recovered with its pieces still intact. The conserved whistles went on tour in Titanic exhibits until 1998, but they had not sounded since that day in 1912. Would their voice ever be heard again? Since that fateful night, the story of Titanic has infused a sense of wonder into the imaginations of millions worldwide. For one young man, a fascination with Titanic's whistles was only one part of a larger passion for all things Titanic.
In 1979, SOS Titanic was on television. Even then, I was just drawn into the story. The most beautiful ship of its time, sinking on its first trip, on its main voyage, an inconceivable thing. It's just a compelling story one would think would be fiction, but it was real. Some people have called the interest in Titanic fever. Once it's in the blood, it never disappears.
In 1998, the Titanic exhibition came to Boston, Massachusetts, and Tarn Stefanos got to turn his passion into a career when he got a job as a Titanic historian.
It was an amazing experience to work with and around objects from the Titanic. It made it a tangible thing. Things that had a direct connection to passengers or crew. No longer some abstract, faded photograph, but something real and something there.
One of the featured artifacts at the exhibit was the complete whistle set.
When one of the chimes was in its container, I just had to reach out and touch it and make that tactile connection to Titanic. And you figure the voyage these whistles went through, high atop the forward funnel, which collapsed in the final moments of the sinking, plunging 2.5 miles to the sea floor. And years later, it's recovered, and there it is in front of me, and I touch it, and it's as if in some eternal circle, I'm linked to the Titanic, something that has always been part of me.
But little did Tarn know the part he was to play in bringing the whistles back to life and spread the wonder of Titanic to thousands. In 1998, the heads of the Titanic exhibit in St. Paul, Minnesota, decided to call upon the services of the Kallenberg brothers in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. Their objective: determine if the recovered whistle set could be sounded for the first time since 1912.
Kallenberg Brothers started in 1895. My great-grandfather was an internal combustion engine pioneer. In the 1930s, during the Depression, they expanded into other things. So there were sound signaling equipment, air horns, and that's the biggest part of it now. So it was kind of a natural fit for us to do something with the Titanic Whistle project.
We were invited over just to see if they were in any condition to be blown.
I went to St. Paul with Zach, and we took a look at them, and we knew that they had been restored, at least, cosmetically, they had been cleaned up for display. But internally, we didn't know if they'd be full of, barnacles or crud or whatever.
It was pretty cool. Just the size of them. Almost 5 feet tall with the manifold going up. about 750 pounds, I estimated.
Just to be able to physically handle them would be difficult. I think they were the largest whistle ever made. We didn't know what kind of shape they were in until we saw the x-rays. I mean, shining a flashlight up there didn't help a whole lot, and nobody at the time had the camera probe or anything, that sophisticated.
I was curious as to see if there was any air pockets inside the castings, because sometimes castings are hollow.
2 of the whistles were completely intact. There were no issues. I think the largest one in the center, because the stems of the whistle were hollow. The stem is the part that really holds up that big dome, that big bell shape you see on it. That part of the largest whistle had imploded, but not entirely. Just enough where obviously the pressure was relieved and water went in. But they were at least structurally sound enough to start putting some low pressure air through them to see if they would work.
But first, the whistles had to make a 300-mile journey from St. Paul, Minnesota, to the Kallenberg Brothers factory in Two Rivers, Wisconsin.
The boss at the exhibition, he told me, do you want to go along? And so I went.
We had a white Ford cargo van that was like driving a buckboard.
We came back, I think we got back a little after midnight through an ice storm.
I'm a New Englander, I'm used to snow, but this was snow.
We laughed about it on the way, but it really wasn't funny. We had a priceless artifact in the back of the panel van through an ice storm. It didn't really seem to make a lot of sense. Like, there should have been a safer way to do it.
But they were in really, really good cases, so we didn't have to worry too much. They were safer than we were, let's put it that way.
We got them here and hung on to them overnight in Zach's garage.
My neighbor, Mary Ellen, next day, she came out with the paper. Hey, Zach, it says here in the paper that, the Titanic whistles are in Two Rivers. And then she saw the van. She goes, so what's with the van?
On the night of April 14, 1912, after an iceberg fatally collided with Titanic's starboard side, the initial reaction among passengers wasn't outright horror. Most didn't know how dire the situation really was. But once the evacuation wore on and panic set in, many faces of human nature began to show.
You've got over 2,000, 200 people that are all reacting, responding differently. You see people jumping into lifeboats. You see people even trying to rush the lifeboats. The situation starts to break down as the disaster unfolds.
These people knew that there was a large number of people that weren't going to survive. Most of them realized pretty quickly there wasn't enough boats. How did these people face these situations? What did they do?
When Titanic struck the iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m., 5th Officer Harold Lowe was asleep in his cabin.
By the time Lowe awakened, he emerged into a fully developed crisis situation, and aware that the situation could deteriorate quite quickly, he went back to his cabin and retrieved his personal firearm, which is a Browning automatic pistol.
Titanic's final resting place lies 12,500 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. At this depth, hungry bacteria feed off the ship's iron, creating what's known as rusticles, rivers of rust dangling off the ship like giant icicles. Scientists say it's only a matter of time until this once mighty ship becomes nothing more than an iron ore shadow on the seafloor. In the year 2000, the Russian submersible Mir-1 did a sweep of Titanic's debris field. The submersible spots a cabin window, which they will discover once belonged to an officer's cabin. On the night of April 14th, 1912, behind a window like this, 5th Officer Harold Lowe slept soundly as the Titanic collided with an iceberg. He would wake up to a ship in a state of panic.
Lowe had gone off watch at 8 o'clock and promptly fell into a very deep sleep.
There was an account that somebody came in and tried to wake him up, and that he was awake and acknowledged it, and then went back to sleep. And he didn't recall this at all. Like, he says, I don't remember anybody coming in. He had a great quote in the inquiries where he says, when we go to sleep, we die. Basically saying, yeah, he goes to bed and he passes right out.
So by the time Lowe awakened to hear voices outside his cabin, he could feel by his feet that they were going down by the bow.
When Lowe went back out on deck, he noticed many lifeboats were launched without an officer on board, so Lowe took charge of lifeboat number 14.
When Lowe arrived at the boat, it was already in the process of being loaded. One of the crew informed him that he'd already had to try and repel people who were trying to press forward and board the boats.
It starts getting a little chaotic. People are pushing and shoving to get in. You had one of the sailors actually took a wooden piece off the tiller and was like basically pushing and prodding people back with this to keep them from piling in.
And Lowe announced that he'd soon put a stop to that. He told anyone who tried to board without his orders, particularly men, that he would shoot them if they attempted to board. And as the boat was being lowered, they could see that there was a large group of men who had crowded round who looked ready to spring.
I think he was concerned with all these people, if they jumped into it, with it being that heavily loaded, that it would buckle under the weight and collapse, and that they'd all fall in the water and die.
So he fired his gun alongside the ship and fired it as they passed each deck to deter any would-be boarders.
In Sydney, Australia, Godfrey Lowe, Harold Lowe's grandson, proudly carries the torch of his grandfather's legacy.
This is the Board of Trade's continuous certificate of discharge, which is essentially the record of my grandfather's service in the Merchant Navy. He was a man's man. He was tough. He had to be. I mean, to run away from home and to go before the mast, living that tough life. And he got this after the Titanic sank, because he lost his original when the Titanic sank, with the first entry being the Titanic. The rating, 5th mate. Date and place of discharge, 15th of April, 1912, at sea.
Harold Lowe had 2 children, one of whom, his son Harold William Lowe, emigrated to Australia as an adult.
We lived on a farm in Tasmania, and my father had a pair of binoculars, and I was allowed to use those, sort of going out hunting rabbits and looking across the field. And one day I saw some engraving on these binoculars. And I thought, what's this? And I read the engraving, and it said, to the real hero of the Titanic, Harold Godfrey Lowe, April 1912. Wow, what's that all about? And so I went and asked my father, and thereby I learnt the full story.
What sort of a man was your father?
He was a man of considerable character, of very high ideals, strong principles, and considerable capacity.
He was born in Barmouth, on the west coast of Wales. He was always interested in boats as a young fellow. When he was 14, his father wanted to apprentice him to a merchant in Liverpool. But Harold Godfrey Lowe wasn't having a bar of it. And he ran away from home that night. He got on a small coastal ship off the Welsh coast and apprenticed at the bottom of the food chain and started there. And he worked his way up through the ranks. He made a name for himself because he controlled some difficult situations, as I understand. That toughened the man up. And so by the time he was 28, when he was on the Titanic, he really showed his mettle on that fateful night. Did your father ever say anything about the night of the sinking?
Yes, but he avoided talking about it. He did not wish to talk about it. He did not like people raising the subject unnecessarily. It was an experience in which he did not wish to record.
After protecting Lifeboat 14 from would-be jumpers, Harold Lowe started planning a rescue mission.
Once the ship went down, you had all these horrible cries from the water, and he's like, hey, I need to go back and try to save some of these people, but how do I do this safely?
He was saying, look, I don't think there's much fear of suction. I'm ready to go back. I'm prepared to take my chances. Are you?
I understand that people weren't too keen on going back because there were a lot of people thrashing out in the water, and if you went back at that particular point in time, he could have easily been swamped.
In order to return for survivors, Lowe needed to first empty passengers from his lifeboat.
He took it upon himself to gather together a number of the other boats into a little flotilla.
He lashed them together and transferred his passengers into the other boats so he could return to pick up survivors.
If you've ever seen the film by James Cameron, there's a young fella standing on the bow of a lifeboat, waving a torch saying, is anybody alive out there? That was my grandfather.
The water temperature being what it was that night, hypothermia set in almost immediately as soon as people were immersed. By the time he had organised the boat and waited to see if the cries would thin out so it would be safe to proceed into the mass of people that were fighting for their lives, unfortunately there were only a handful of people left alive.
They did find 3 to 4 people that they pulled out of the water, one of whom was either injured or had been in the water too long and ended up passing away, sadly. But he did save multiple people, but it was just too late to get more than that.
He always insisted that he had to wait as long as he did until it was safe to return to pick up survivors.
Because if he'd gone in before, the 40 people in his lifeboat could have ended up being capsized out. You'd end up with 40 more lives lost. And that was a judgment call, a very tough call to make, and he made it.
He'd made some comment about like how he waited too long, and certainly I think that if he would have had a chance to do it over, he might have gone back sooner. He seemed like he was regretful about that.
Out of the 18 lifeboats successfully launched, Harold Lowe's was one of only 2 to go back to pick up survivors. He also ended up saving passengers from collapsible boats A and D, towing them to the rescue ship Carpathia. In the end, only approximately 705 people would survive the disaster. Underwater missions to the Titanic debris site have resulted in thousands of artifacts being brought to the surface. Some artifacts are easily identifiable, but discovering the identities behind the smaller, personal items requires a bit more detective work.
This originally had some handles on each side here, and as you can see, we've got quite a bit of degradation going on with the leather. Some loss here. It's still got a great life to it. Well, that alligator skin is so darn thick, it certainly held up very well during all those years under the water.
The mysterious alligator purse was recovered in the year 2000. Researchers wondered who it could have belonged to. As it turned out, the answer was right inside. After sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 88 years, the alligator purse made its way to this top-secret warehouse and into the care of conservator David Galusha.
When an object is found at the bottom of the ocean, it's in a pretty pristine environment. It's 2.5 miles down, it's dark, not a lot of oxygen, not a lot of movement. You pull this object out, well, now it's being hit with oxygen. So it's cataloged, photographed, then it's wrapped up and placed back into the same water that it came out of. And it stays there until it comes back to be conserved. Conservation is taking an object and stabilizing it to a condition where it can stay, constant. It's not deteriorating at the same rate that it was before. Initially, once this went through the desalination, removing the salts through being in salt water down at Titanic, fortunately, because it was tanned so well and the alligator skin is so thick, the tannins that were used kept it pretty supple. So it's simply a matter of removing the impurities and then adding a little more of some of that natural tanning oils to make it soft again.
For world-renowned Titanic conservator Alex Klingelhofer and her team, each artifact has a tale to tell.
When you get into the personal artifacts that have been recovered and you can identify the owner, that gives you a story about that person, why they were traveling, what their hopes and dreams were. You have an understanding of the life that was lost.
Inside the alligator bag, researchers found a cache of papers.
It's very interesting that the paper survived, but we're very happy that it did. Paper at that time was rag paper, a better quality paper, and it was recovered from inside a leather bag, which will protect the paper from the bacterial or microbial communities at the bottom of the ocean. The fact that we still can read the writing is wonderful.
The documents led researchers to believe the owner of the purse was a British woman leaving her old life behind in search of a fresh start. Her name was Marian Meanwell.
Marian Meanwell was a very interesting woman. Her alligator purse, it was like a treasure trove of all of her family papers. This letter here from Wheeler and Sons, it's really a reference letter. It says that she was a good tenant, and of course, as a single woman in Victorian and Edwardian England, she would need to have some sort of reference that would maintain her respectability in society. She knew she was emigrating, and it was really as if someone was taking all of the documents that really meant something, that proved she was an honorable woman, and they're all in this one alligator purse.
Marian Meanwell was a 63-year-old milliner and dressmaker from Yorkshire, England.
Her daughter, Margaret, married an acrobat, and they had relocated to New York City. She and her husband had 2 children, but sadly, he died in April of 1911 from consumption or pneumonia. So Margaret suggests that perhaps her mother could relocate to New York and help her take care of the children while she worked. This is one of the small bags that she had. I would imagine that she made it herself since she was a skilled seamstress. And some of the papers that we see here were found in here.
Marian sold all of her belongings at auction and used the money to buy a ticket on the White Star Line ship, the RMS Majestic. Destination, New York City. But the coal strike of 1912 would change Marian's life forever.
On the 1st of March, nearly 1 million coal miners walked out. And this, of course, had the effect of paralysing it the next 37 days. The coal strike ended on the 6th of April, but it didn't necessarily mean that supplies immediately resumed.
Fate took her hand, and she was transferred by White Star Line from the Majestic, which is crossed off here, to Titanic. She ended up on Titanic and sadly did not survive the sinking.
This is a tragedy that a lot of people don't know about. Passengers, they thought they were very lucky initially to get upgraded or put onto this state-of-the-art vessel. And then quite a large number of those people that did that, of course, didn't survive.
Each artifact that is recovered from the wreck site of Titanic has something important to say.
Comes the first whistle.
At the Kallenberg Brothers in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. The recovered whistle set is safely placed to ensure no damage.
We had to make sure that there wasn't any debris on the interior where if you put pressure to it, it would hit the bell of the whistle and potentially damage it.
There was a lot of sediment from the bottom of the ocean still in there. So that was the first step. You know, you have to be careful. It's priceless and you don't want to damage it.
We actually set up each of the whistles independently. There's a lot of harmonics, a lot of sound content there. If you were to put them all together immediately, you don't necessarily know that each of the whistles is performing well. We started on low pressure.
The lower pressure, if there's any loose debris in there that you missed, you're not going to do any damage.
Oh, we ain't going no more than that.
Good.
Huh? It's coming out of there.
That was foremost in our mind. Don't hurt the whistles.
Everyone had to wear ear protection because you wouldn't want to be left deaf by this process.
You hear that?
I had ear protection on, but my ears were ringing for much of the day.
Give it. I'll just let it run up.
Think of blowing across the lid of a pop bottle. There's no moving parts. It's just physics. It's a musical instrument.
I had the chance to pull the lever to blow, I think it was the center whistle.
With each whistle tested and functional, the team was ready to sound them all together.
People in that room, they knew this was a moment unique.
It looks a lot bigger in person, doesn't it? Mm-hmm.
We're hearing this for the first time since 1912. No one else has heard this.
Go.
It was the most heart-stopping moment because it occurred to me, this is Titanic's voice.
It was a massive sound.
Was that pretty loud?
It put so much air through the test chamber, you literally feel the gust of air pushing you back out the door.
It was this tortured, anguished groan from the past, like the ship was crying out and the voice suddenly broke, and then the voice emanated and faded, almost as if it was crying out from 1912. It was very powerful.
You're welcome. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Once it was determined it was safe to blow the whistles,
They took them back, and it was a couple months until they had everything set up to do the sounding in St. Paul.
Harold Lowe was in charge of Lifeboat 14, towing collapsible D behind him. They reached the rescue ship Carpathia at approximately 7 a.m.
I understand from a number of witnesses that they thought that he was the epitome of British seamanship, British bulldog, a very sort of sound young fellow, calm in a crisis.
Once safely on the Carpathia, Harold Lowe was already being hailed as a hero by grateful passengers.
He was strolling around the deck. One of the fellows who he'd rescued from that sinking lifeboat, a first-class passenger, came up to him and he said, "Thank you so much for saving my life, and I'd like to give you a souvenir." He said, "Now, I've got these gold sovereigns. I'm not going to use them when I get back to America. You have a gold sovereign."
Renee Harris was one of Lowe's warmest admirers. She left in Collapsible D, which was one of the two last lifeboats to be successfully launched.
Renee Harris was a first-class passenger from New York. She was the first female theatrical producer in the United States. Along with her husband, Henry B. Harris, they owned several New York theaters and traveled the world for business and pleasure.
She had broken her arm earlier that day in a fall on the grand staircase, and she was terribly concerned about her own very much loved husband who she had left behind on the ship. So she was in a very, I think, physically and emotionally precarious situation. And she had a chance to observe Lowe that night, and for her, he was, this beacon of sailorly conduct and heroism. Once she was established on the Carpathia, Renee Harris sent for Harold Lowe. She wanted to give him an appreciation of his actions that night. And she suggested to him, look, she had no money on her, but when they got to New York, she wanted to make him a monetary gift. And Harold Lowe was horrified. He said he couldn't accept money for having done his duty.
My grandfather was pretty self-effacing. He didn't look at hero worship. He didn't want to be big noted. He just quietly went about his business.
But Renee Harris was determined. When the survivors aboard the Carpathia arrived in New York, she arranged one more get-together with Lowe.
And she again pressed on him that she wanted to give him some form of reward. And he refused all these approaches and said, you know, I've only done my duty. I only hollered. Anybody can holler. But I think he hadn't counted on the persistence of Renee Harris.
The word of Titanic's fate spread quickly around the world. Family members anxiously awaited news of their loved ones' whereabouts. Towns and communities across the United Kingdom were missing large numbers of its citizens. 724 of Titanic's crew came from the Southampton area alone, but only 175 would end up coming back. After the tragedy, 5th Officer Harold Lowe returned to his home, the small seaside town of Barmouth, Wales.
When Lowe was finally able to return, he came back to a town that was very proud of their homegrown hero. And they had already been collecting money to present him with an appropriate gift.
On June 21st, 1912, the citizens of Barmouth gathered in the town pavilion to honor the bravery of Harold Lowe.
The theatre was crowded with people all the way up to the roof trusses, eager to see their hero.
This is an album of names of subscribers towards a presentation to Harold Godfrey Lowe, my grandfather, 5th Officer of the RMS Titanic. And it has written in it all the names of the good people of Barmouth who subscribed to the presentation of a gift, which was a chronometer gold watch and chain.
I consider it a privilege to hand you this gold watch and chain as a token of admiration felt to you by a large circle of friends. We are proud of you, and whenever you look upon this watch and feel its ticking, remember that there are warm hearts thinking of you.
And this is the chronometer, which was presented to my grandfather. It's a beautiful watch. Presented to Harold Godfrey Lowe, 5th Officer, RMS Titanic, by friends of his in Barmouth and elsewhere.
It wasn't just the town of Barmouth who honored Lowe that night. Renee Harris sent a surprise token of gratitude to her hero.
In addition to the gold watch and chain, I have much pleasure on behalf of Mrs. Henry B. Harris, New York, to present to you with this fine set of marine instruments, which I understand are very valuable and the best money could procure. Your brave and heroic conduct is appreciated on both sides of the Atlantic.
They showed some footage and a band played Near Am I God to Thee, and we had some speeches. Then they turned to Harold Lowe and asked him to address the audience. And he gave them what was described as a smart naval salute. And then he started off with the obligatory thanks to the organising committee and to all those involved. By the time he got to Renee Harris, he was so overcome by emotion, he broke down visibly and couldn't speak further.
He was presented with 3 instruments, the sextants, the telescope and the binoculars. And I have the binoculars in my possession, and I'm very proud possession it is too. Those other nautical instruments are still in the house that he owned in Agony, in Wales.
In Harold Lowe's historic home resides his other grandson and Godfrey's cousin, retired merchant seaman John Lowe.
Here are a couple of pen and ink drawings done by my grandfather, Cedric, and a little one with a sense of humour. Little White Star Line ships, names ended in IC, so he's managed to get seasick out of it.
Harold retired from service in 1931. He lived in this seaside home in Wales with his wife and 2 children until his death in 1944.
They always liked this area because of the boats. He was well known around here. People knew who he was, Titanic Lowe.
After the disaster, Harold Lowe kept in touch with some of the people he saved that night.
Where is it? This is a address book. Mrs. Henry B. Harris, Hudson Theatre, New York, USA. Oh, this are the 3 parts of what Mrs. Harris gave us. We've got the sextant here. The scale, it's silver and etched. He might have taken his sextant. I know I did. I used it. The telescope to Harold G. Lowe, the real hero of the Titanic. With deepest gratitude from Mrs. Henry B. Harris, April 1912.
Could he have gone back and saved a few more lives? He'll never know. But he did the best he could. He made the judgment on the night. He was brave and incredible. I'm just so proud of being associated with someone with those genes. I would have loved to have met him. Just really would have loved to.
When word got out the whistles were going to be blown in St. Paul, Titanic enthusiasts from around the world started making travel plans.
My mother, probably about the mid-70s, told me about this wonderful ship called the Titanic. It struck an iceberg and sank with a great loss of lives, but the ship was very beautiful and very elegant. And of course, I found it so fascinating. 1999, we heard that the Titanic exhibit was going to be in St. Paul. Gotta go, right? Loaded up my 2 small boys, my wife. Of course, you gotta take the video camera with.
It was really something. The crowd was massive. I mean, the streets were packed, and I had to say a few words. So I said a few words. I don't think they were very good words.
Today, as we listen to the haunting sound of our last ship, we should reflect on many heroes and innocent victims who lost their lives on that fateful night.
It was nerve-wracking. I mean, you could look out and you could not see the end of that sea of people going up into downtown. It was a stressful deal. And my thought at the time was, I hope they have enough air.
I was maybe 50 feet or so from the whistles. And the first time they didn't really do a countdown, they just said, here we go, and they blew them.
The reaction was a roar from the crowd. There was silence when people realized, this is Titanic we're hearing. A voice from the past, a dead voice, suddenly alive.
It was impressive. Far more so than it was when we had them here in our facility because the air was endless. And it's completely different outside. It doesn't sound like that when you're in a test chamber.
We wanted more. 3, 2, 1. And they blew them a lot longer this time, the second time. The crowd applauded and roared.
What moved me about the event in St. Paul was not the sound of the whistles, but the reaction of the people.
It was a happy time and also a sad time. Many people that perished that night, that's also what they heard before the ship sank.
I mean, you see it in pictures and then you see it in real life. It's right there. Brings it home a little bit.
It was like going back in time. I still can't believe it happened.
It was a very meaningful time. We were a part of the new history of the Titanic.
That day in St. Paul would be the last time the whistles were sounded. Due to their fragile condition, it was deemed too risky to attempt again. But for one glorious day, the sound of Titanic's voice awoke the imaginations of thousands. In a top-secret warehouse in Atlanta, Tarn Stefanos is about to see the artifacts he has been dreaming about for years.
Oh my goodness.
So I am going to
Wow.
see if Tarn knows what these items are. Do you recognize these pieces?
This, I believe, is a fragment from the fireplace in the first-class smoking room.
That's right.
I mean, this is from one of the most beautiful rooms on board the ship. And it was utterly devastated when the ship broke apart. This captures the beauty, the intricacy of the carving, but also the devastation. I mean, this fireplace was shattered in the breakup, and yet the beauty is still there.
Yeah.
So it's like a trampled flower almost, in that it has both the horror and the beauty mixed in together.
That's really poetic and very moving. Wow.
I never thought I'd see this in person. This is just astounding. This, I believe, came from the grand staircase.
It did. We also have a few crystals and some tile, but very, very little else that belonged to the grand staircases because it was so destroyed when the ship sank. Right at that point is where it broke apart and fell into the ocean.
To see these pieces in person, artifacts from the two most beautiful areas on board the ship somehow survived to this very day, despite both areas being completely destroyed. It brings the smoking room to me in person, and it brings the grand staircase, and by extension, the people who interacted with these parts of the ship. It's very special.
Like the sound of her whistles fading on the wind, the story of Titanic grows ever more distant as time marches on. 2 weeks after filming his interview, John Lowe died surrounded by those he loved. By preserving his words and memories, and the memories of all those whose lives Titanic touched, as well as through the recovery and conservation of Titanic's artifacts. In this way, Titanic sails on.